As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving deep into the raw, unfiltered world of organized crime, not through fiction, but through absolute reality. Together, we are opening the pages of Wiseguy, Life in a Mafia Family by acclaimed journalist Nicholas Pileggi. This isn't just another Mafia story. It is a riveting insider account of Henry Hill, a man who spent 25 years living inside New York's mob culture. It's also the very book that inspired Martin Scorsese's cinematic masterpiece, Goodfellas. So, sit back, put on your headphones, and step into the shadows of New York's underworld, where loyalty, power, and betrayal go hand in hand. Listen closely, because the story begins now. In 1955, 11-year-old Henry Hill accidentally took his first step into the world of organized crime. Henry lived with his large family in Brooklyn, right across the street from a small cab stand. He had always been fascinated by the mysterious men who gathered there. They drove expensive Cadillacs and Lincolns, wore silk suits and huge coats, and showed off diamond rings, gold watches, and thick rolls of cash. They seemed powerful and untouchable. One day, Henry decided to ask for a small after-school job at the cab stand. His parents were happy at first. His father believed that working young taught children the value of money, while his mother liked the idea of Henry staying busy and helping the family. But Henry quickly became obsessed with the cab stand. Instead of working there only after school, he started spending almost all his time there. He went before school, after school, and even did his homework there. Soon, he stopped spending time with children his own age. His father became worried and angry. He knew that the men at the cab stand were involved in criminal activities and warned Henry, "They're bums. You're going to get in trouble." Henry pretended that he was only running errands, but he knew exactly what was happening around him. The money, power, respect, and lifestyle of the mob fascinated him. What began as a simple after-school job slowly became Henry's entrance into a dangerous world of organized crime. Back in 1955, the Euclid Avenue taxicab and limousine service in Brownsville, East New York, was far more than an ordinary taxi dispatch center. It had become a meeting place for almost every kind of person connected to the neighborhood's criminal and underground world. Inside and around the cab stand, there were horse players, bookies, lawyers, gamblers, ex-jockeys, construction workers, union officials, politicians, truck drivers, loan sharks, bail bondsmen, off-duty police officers, and even a few retired killers from the infamous Murder Incorporated era. The place was practically a headquarters for people involved in gambling, loans, corruption, and other illegal activities. At the center of this world was Paul Vario, a powerful figure in organized crime and one of the men controlling many of the local rackets. Vario had been involved with the law since he was very young. In 1921, when he was only 11, he was already arrested for truancy. As he grew older, his criminal record became much longer, including accusations of loan sharking, burglary, tax evasion, bribery, bookmaking, and assault. Despite his criminal reputation, Vario tried to keep some level of order in his neighborhood. He disliked unnecessary violence, especially violence that he had not authorized. He understood that random killings and bodies left in the streets could attract too much attention from the police and create problems for his criminal operations. For Vario, violence was not about anger or emotion. It was something that had to be controlled because business came first. Vario was also an intimidating man physically. He stood around 6 feet tall and weighed more than 240 pounds. He had a huge chest and powerful arms, giving the appearance of someone who was almost impossible to challenge. He moved slowly and calmly, as if he knew that nobody could force him to hurry. He rarely appeared nervous or surprised. Even when something unexpected happened, he would react slowly and deliberately. His calmness gave people the impression that he was almost fearless and untouchable. But Henry Hill eventually discovered that Vario's slow movements did not mean he was weak. On one occasion, Henry watched Vario grab a sawed-off baseball bat from his car and chase a man up 5 flights of stairs because a man owed him money from a loan. By the time Henry was 12 years old, he had already become useful to Vario. Henry began running small errands for him, buy his Chesterfield cigarettes and black coffee, delivering messages, and helping him communicate with people around the city. Henry would frequently ride in Vario's black Chevrolet Impala, sometimes getting in and out of the car dozens of times in a single day. While Vario waited behind the wheel, Henry would bring different people to him for private conversations. For Henry, this was no longer simply a job at a neighborhood cab stand. He was becoming personally involved with one of the most powerful men in the local criminal world. What began with small errands and coffee deliveries was slowly turning Henry into a trusted young helper and giving him a direct view of the money, power, influence, and danger of organized crime. As Henry Hill became more involved with Paul Vario, people in the criminal clubs of East Harlem slowly began to accept him. At first, the older men were suspicious whenever Paulie brought Henry into their clubs. Henry was only a young boy, and they looked at him as if he might secretly be a police officer. But when one of them finally asked Paulie who Henry was, Vario simply replied, "He's a cousin. He's blood." Those few words were enough. From that moment, the older men accepted Henry and stopped questioning his presence. Henry was learning more than just how to run errands. He was beginning to understand the rules of the mob without anyone directly teaching him. He made money working for Paulie, and sometimes he even got to enjoy himself. When he cleaned Vario's boat, for example, he was paid and allowed to spend the rest of the day fishing. His only responsibility was to keep Paulie and the other men supplied with cold beer and wine. Vario was extremely careful about protecting his identity and keeping his possessions away from his name. He never put his name on his boats, never had it on a doorbell, and avoided having a telephone. Whenever he was arrested, he would use his mother's address instead of his own. His advice to Henry was simple: never put your name on anything. Henry took that lesson seriously. As time passed, Henry began developing an instinct for the criminal world. He learned how to understand what Paul wanted before Paul even asked. He knew when he should stay nearby and when he should quietly disappear. Nobody had to explain these things to him. One day, when Henry was only 12, some men from outside the neighborhood came to the cab stand to have a private conversation with Paulie. Henry immediately understood that he and the other young men were expected to leave. Without anyone telling him, he stood up and began walking away. Then Paulie looked at him and smiled. "It's okay. You can stay." The other men continued leaving, clearly nervous about what was going to happen. Henry stayed behind. That moment was important. Henry realized that Paulie trusted him enough to allow him into conversations that other people were not permitted to hear, and he would remain in that world for the next 25 years. At the time Henry started working at the cab stand, Paul Vario essentially controlled Brownsville, East New York. As an important member of the Lucchese crime family, Vario controlled illegal gambling, loan sharking, labor rackets, and extortion in the area. But Vario's role was not simply about making money. He also acted as a kind of judge and mediator among criminals. When disputes broke out between violent and stubborn men, Vario settled them. He handled grudges, prevented conflicts from becoming wars, and maintained order among people who were often difficult to control. Vario also used his brothers to operate his criminal network and secretly controlled several legitimate businesses. One of them was Presto Pizzeria, located near the cab stand. Henry worked there and learned how to cook, but he also discovered that the restaurant had another purpose. Its basement was used as an accounting room for Vario's illegal policy operation, where Henry learned how to handle the financial records. Another business was Fontainebleau Florist. There, Henry learned how to prepare funeral wreaths for deceased union members. Even an ordinary flower shop was connected to Vario's network. The Vario brothers each had their own responsibilities. Lenny Vario, the oldest, was involved with construction unions. He had connections with contractors and construction companies who paid money or provided fake no-show jobs in exchange for protection from strikes, labor problems, and even fires. Paul Vario was the main figure who controlled the broader operation. Tommy Vario, another brother, was a construction union delegate and was involved in illegal gambling, bookmaking, and loan sharking at construction sites. Vito, Tutty, Vario ran the cab stand where Henry first started working. He was the brother who actually gave Henry his first job. Finally, Salvatore, Babe Vario, the youngest brother, controlled underground card and dice games. These games were held in apartments, school basements, and garages. Babe was also responsible for making sure local police were paid off so that the illegal gambling could continue without interference. For Henry, All of this was becoming normal. What had started as a simple job for a 12-year-old boy had turned into an education in crime, money, loyalty, secrecy, and power. He was no longer merely watching the mob from the outside. He was becoming part of it. As Henry became closer to the Vario family, he discovered that their world was not only about crime and business. The Vario brothers were all married and had children, some of whom were around Henry's age. On weekends, the entire family would gather at their mother's house. Their father, who had worked as a building superintendent, had died when the brothers were still young. Those weekend gatherings were unforgettable for Henry. The house was always loud and full of life, with card games, laughter, food, and relatives coming and going. Mrs. Vario's kitchen was constantly producing huge amounts of pasta, veal, chicken, and other Italian dishes. Friends and relatives would arrive throughout the afternoon, and many of them would secretly slip folded dollar bills into Henry's shirt. There were pinball machines in the basement, pigeons on the roof, cannoli, lemon ice, and gelato. To Henry, it felt like the most exciting place in the world. But something had changed. Once the Varios discovered that Henry's mother was Sicilian, Henry was no longer treated as just another neighborhood kid working at the cab stand. He became part of the family circle. He was welcomed into their homes, allowed to open their refrigerators, run errands for the Vario wives, and play with their children. They treated him generously and often gave him whatever he wanted. Henry later realized that this acceptance had a powerful effect on him. From the first day he entered the cab stand, he felt as if he had finally found home. Even before he started working there, Henry had watched the men from his bedroom window. He admired their expensive cars, money, confidence, and influence. Now, he was actually becoming part of their world. By the age of 12, Henry had already decided what he wanted to become. A gangster, a wise guy. To Henry, being a wise guy seemed even better than becoming the president of the United States. It meant having power in a neighborhood where ordinary people had very little power. It meant receiving special treatment and privileges that working-class families could never normally obtain. Tutti Vario, whose real name was Vito, was a man running the cab stand. He had lost his left leg during the Korean War, and although he had learned to live with his disability, he could no longer move as quickly as he wanted. Because of this, Tutti had been searching for a young helper who was fast, intelligent, reliable, and willing to work hard. He needed someone who could clean the taxis and limousines, deliver pizzas from the Presto Pizzeria, pick up money from a small bar he owned nearby, and handle food and drink orders quickly and accurately. Other neighborhood kids had failed him, including his own son. They were too slow, careless, or easily distracted. Tutti needed someone who could hustle, and, most importantly, someone he could trust. Then he found Henry Hill. Henry was exactly what Tutti had been looking for. He was quick, smart, and took his responsibilities seriously. He could run errands faster than anyone else and rarely made mistakes. At first, Henry was paid $1 for cleaning the taxis and limousines. The limousines were used for funerals, weddings, and transporting wealthy gamblers to Vario's card and dice games. Henry worked so efficiently that he often ended up cleaning them again without being asked. Tutti was impressed by the boy's dedication. After only 2 months, he decided to teach Henry something far more unusual: how to drive the taxis and limousines around the parking lot. There was just one problem. Henry was only 12 years old. Tutti solved the problem by carrying a phone book outside and placing it beneath Henry, so the boy could see over the steering wheel. Tutti wanted Henry driving by the end of the day. It took several days, but Henry gradually learned how to maneuver the cars around the lot. Within 6 months, he was able to reverse large limousines with incredible precision, squeezing between obstacles and making the tires squeal. His schoolmates would stand behind the old wooden fence, watching him with amazement and jealousy. One day, Henry noticed something that surprised him even more. His father was secretly watching him drive. His father had never learned how to drive himself. Yet here was his 12-year-old son maneuvering expensive cars. That evening, Henry waited for his father to mention it, but his father said nothing. Henry understood why. His father hated the cab stand and knew the kind of people Henry was working for. So, Henry also remained silent. For Henry, however, this life felt incredible. He believed he was the luckiest kid in the world. While his father could not understand why the cab stand meant so much to him, Henry felt that he finally belonged somewhere. He was treated like an adult. Important men trusted him with their cars. Wise guys would arrive, throw their Cadillac keys to a 12-year-old boy, and expect him to park them. Henry could barely see over the steering wheel, but he was driving their Cadillacs. To Henry, it wasn't just a job anymore. It was a fantasy, and he was beginning to live it. By the age of 12, Henry Hill was already making more money than he knew how to spend. At first, he enjoyed showing off his new wealth by treating his school friends. He would pay for them to ride horses through the marshes of Canarsie or take them to Steeplechase Amusement Park, where they could enjoy huge attractions, including a 260-foot parachute ride. But Henry eventually became bored with ordinary childhood activities. The amusement parks and horse rides that excited his classmates could not compare with what he was experiencing at the cab stand. For Henry, the real excitement was a criminal world surrounding Paul Vario and his associates. A major reason Henry was attracted to this life was his father's situation. Henry's father worked extremely hard as an electrician, helping build skyscrapers and housing projects, and even helping organize the Electrical Workers Union. Yet despite all his work, the family remained poor. They lived in a cramped 3-bedroom house with 7 children, including Henry's disabled younger brother. Henry watched his father work his entire life without ever achieving the wealth or lifestyle he wanted. He decided that he would not live the same life. No matter how much his father shouted at him or punished him for spending time at a cab stand, Henry refused to listen. He was becoming obsessed with the idea of making money and getting paid. Every day at the cab stand taught him something new. He listened to the criminals discussing their schemes and watched money and stolen goods move through the place. Stolen appliances, expensive clothing taken from trucks, and untaxed cigarettes passed through the cab stand before being sold. Henry also became involved in the Vario's illegal numbers operation. He delivered policy slips containing people's bets to apartments and houses throughout the neighborhood. The Varios would rent rooms from local families, sometimes paying around $150 a week plus a free telephone, and use them as temporary offices. Henry began entering the homes of people he knew from school. At first, their parents were surprised to see him carrying bags full of betting slips. They assumed he was there to play with their children. Eventually, however, they realized Henry was becoming involved with something much bigger. He was growing up differently from the other kids. With his first real money in his pocket, Henry went shopping without his mother for the first time. He went to Benny Field's, the clothing store where the wise guys bought their suits. He came out wearing a dark blue pinstriped, double-breasted suit with enormous sharp lapels. Henry was extremely proud of himself. When his mother saw him, she immediately shouted, "You look just like a gangster." Instead of being embarrassed, Henry was delighted. To him, that was a compliment. By the age of 13, Henry had already spent a full year working at the cab stand. He was handsome, confident, and becoming increasingly skilled at navigating the world around him. He had learned how to avoid his father's angry hands and even how to escape racetrack security guards who tried to keep him away because he was too young. Henry was beginning to look like a miniature version of the men he admired. He copied their clothing and gestures. He tried to eat the same Italian seafood dishes they ate, even when they made him sick. He drank extremely bitter, burning black coffee simply because that was what the wise guys drank. In reality, Henry was still just a kid pretending to be a gangster. But the important difference was that he wasn't treating it like a game. He was seriously studying their behavior, learning their methods, and absorbing their values. The cab stand had become his school, the wise guys had become his teachers, and making money had become his greatest ambition. Henry Hill was no longer dreaming about becoming a gangster someday. He was already being trained to become one. Chapter 2. From a very young age, Henry Hill was no longer living a normal childhood. While other kids were playing and going to school, Henry spent most of his days around the cab stand near his neighborhood. He watched the older men, listened to their conversations, and slowly began learning how their world worked. Every day he became more interested in the lifestyle of the men around him, the money, the respect, and the power they seemed to have. By the time Henry was 13, he had already started making money through small illegal businesses. He collected betting numbers, sold fireworks, and found ways to make profits from anything he could. He even convinced taxi drivers to buy beer for him, which he later sold to students at school for a higher price. To Henry, these things did not feel like crimes. They felt like business. He was learning how to make deals, control situations, and earn money. Soon, Henry became involved with neighborhood thieves. He helped some young criminals sell stolen items by giving them money in advance, and then finding buyers for things they stole, such as radios, clothing, and other goods. He was becoming a small businessman inside the criminal world. One of the first serious schemes Henry became involved in was passing counterfeit money. Before major holidays like Easter and Mother's Day, Henry would skip school and go with Johnny Mazzola, a gambler and drug addict who knew a counterfeiter named Beansy. They bought fake $20 bills for a small amount of money and then used them in stores around different neighborhoods. Johnny taught Henry the tricks of the trade. He explained how to make the fake bills look more realistic and how to behave when using them. Henry learned never to carry more than one fake bill at a time, because if he got caught, he could pretend someone else had given it to him. Several times he was discovered, but because he was only a child, he would cry, act scared, and convince people that he had made a mistake. Then he would quickly leave and move on to another neighborhood. The group usually worked in one area until the fake bills became known. Once banks and stores noticed the counterfeit money, they would warn cashiers and display the serial numbers of the fake bills. Then Henry and Johnny would move somewhere else and continue their operation. During Christmas season, Henry learned another trick from Tutty. They would take cheap, weak Christmas trees and secretly fill them with extra branches to make them appear fuller. After decorating them and placing them in good locations, they sold them for much higher prices. The customers would only discover later that the trees were fake and began falling apart. For Henry and the people around him, everything was a plan or a scheme. They were always looking for ways to make money, even when they already had enough. Henry once worked in an expensive Italian grocery store, but his real purpose was to steal valuable products and throw them into Tutty's nearby taxis. They stole expensive food like imported olive oil, prosciutto, and tuna, not because they needed it, but because stealing itself gave them excitement. Henry later understood that this feeling was common among criminals. Years afterward, when he was involved in stolen credit cards, Paul Vario would ask him for stolen cards whenever he went out. Paul believed that drinks and entertainment were better when they were paid for with stolen money, because the pleasure came from knowing they had cheated someone. After about 6 months around a cab stand, Henry became more involved with the Vario family's illegal gambling operations. During the day, he helped prepare gambling tables, and at night, he guided wealthy players to secret locations where card games and dice games were held. Some of these games were even organized in the basement of Henry's own school. The Varios controlled everything. They had people watching for police, and many local officers were already being paid by the organization. Henry became skilled at recognizing undercover police officers by their appearance, behavior, and cars. The gambling operations were large and professional. Many different people attended: businessmen, restaurant owners, doctors, union workers, and criminals. The games were organized almost like real casinos, with dealers, security, bartenders, and loan sharks. The Varios controlled the money and took a percentage from every game. Henry began finding his own ways to earn extra money. Instead of buying sandwiches for gamblers from a local deli, he started making them himself and keeping the profit. When the owners of the deli noticed they were losing business, they offered Henry a deal. They would pay him a percentage of the money he spent on sandwiches if he returned to buying from them. Henry accepted proudly because it was the first time adults treated him like a businessman. During this period, Henry met Jimmy Burke, a man who became one of the most important figures in his life. Jimmy was different from the other criminals Henry knew. While many wise guys were careful with their money, Jimmy was extremely generous. He gave large tips to doormen, bartenders, and anyone who helped him. Jimmy was also a dangerous criminal. He loved stealing and enjoyed the excitement of committing crimes. He became famous for hijacking trucks and stealing valuable shipments. Unlike many criminals who threatened truck drivers, Jimmy sometimes gave them money before leaving, which made some people respect him even though he was a criminal. Jimmy had a frightening reputation. He could be friendly and polite one moment, then become extremely violent the next. People never knew what side of him they would see. However, his ability to make money was the reason people tolerated his unpredictable behavior. When Henry turned 14, Tutty and Lenny Vario gave him a union card connected to construction work. The car allowed Henry to appear as a worker and receive a fake salary, while the money was actually controlled by the Varios. It also helped him collect gambling debts and illegal payments from construction sites. Henry enjoyed the respect that came with being connected to the union and the Varios. Workers knew who he was and treated him differently. He felt important and powerful, even though he was still only a teenager. Eventually, Henry's double life was discovered by his father. The school sent a letter saying that Henry had not attended classes for months. Henry had been pretending to go to school while spending his days working with the gang. His father was furious and punished him severely. When Tutty learned what happened, he decided to solve the problem in his own criminal way. He and some men kidnapped a mailman and threatened him, warning him never to deliver another school letter to Henry's house. After that, Henry stopped receiving messages from school, and his education effectively ended. Henry's life continued moving deeper into crime. He witnessed violence for the first time when a wounded man came running to the pizzeria after being shot. Henry tried to help him, but the older criminals around him only cared about avoiding trouble. Later, Tutty introduced Henry to a more serious crime. A new taxi company had opened nearby and threatened Tutty's business. After attempts to scare the owner failed, Tutty decided to destroy the competition. He gave Henry a hammer and gasoline, and together they damaged and burned the rival company's taxis. For Henry, this was another step into the criminal world. He was no longer just watching criminals. He was actively participating. At 16, Henry was arrested for the first time. Tutty gave him a stolen Texaco credit card and sent him with Lenny to buy tires. They did not know the card was being watched by police. When they returned to the gas station, detectives were waiting and arrested Henry. Even during his arrest, Henry tried to act like a professional criminal. He refused to talk to police because Tutty and others had taught him never to cooperate with authorities. Soon, a lawyer connected to the Varios arrived and quickly arranged his release. The gang celebrated his arrest as if it was a major achievement. They treated it as a sign that Henry had officially entered their world. They took him out for food and drinks, congratulating him because he had experienced his first arrest. However, Henry began feeling pressure. His father was becoming suspicious, and Henry feared what would happen if his family discovered everything. He even considered joining the army as a way to escape his problems. When he told Paul Vario about his decision, Paul was surprised and worried. He asked Henry if something was wrong and offered to help him avoid joining if he wanted. But Henry decided to continue with his choice. By the end of this chapter, Henry had completely changed. He had started as a young boy fascinated by criminals and had slowly become part of their world. The streets around the cab stand had become his school, and the criminals around him had become his teachers. He no longer saw ordinary life as exciting. The world of money, power, and crime had already taken control of him. Chapter 3. Henry Hill was born in 1943 in Brownsville, East New York, a neighborhood in Brooklyn that shaped almost everything about his future. At first glance, it looked like a normal working-class area filled with small houses, factories, and hard-working families. Many Italian-American immigrants and Eastern European Jews lived there, working long hours in factories and businesses to build better lives for themselves. However, beneath the surface, the neighborhood had another side. Brownsville, East New York, was also known as a place where organized crime had deep roots. Because of its location near transportation routes, industrial areas, and the waterways around Jamaica Bay, it became a perfect place for criminals involved in smuggling, gambling, and other illegal businesses. The area had a long history connected to famous criminals and gangs. For many young people growing up there, successful gangsters were not viewed as villains. They were often seen as powerful and respected figures. Children heard stories about men who became rich and influential through crime, and these figures became neighborhood legends. During Henry's childhood, local criminals were almost like celebrities. Names such as Al Capone, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello, and other powerful mob figures were known throughout the streets. Their stories created an environment where young boys could easily become fascinated by the criminal lifestyle. Paul Vario, the man Henry would later work for, was one of the most feared figures in the neighborhood. His group was known for violence and intimidation. They handled problems for the larger Lucchese crime family and were involved in protecting illegal businesses, collecting debts, controlling territories, and intimidating anyone who challenged them. The people around Paul were not only criminals, many of them also appeared to be normal businessmen. Some owned restaurants, trucking companies, or other businesses while secretly participating in illegal activities. For example, some gangsters who were involved in theft or violence also owned legitimate businesses and lived ordinary lives in the community. Young men like Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, Tommy DeSimone, and others grew up surrounded by this world. They were known as tough kids who were often involved in fights, thefts, and trouble with the police. As they grew older, many became regular targets of police investigations and arrests. Because they were constantly exposed to crime, they became comfortable with the legal system. They knew how police investigations worked, how arrests happened, and how to contact lawyers quickly. Getting arrested was not something mysterious or terrifying to them. It was simply part of their lifestyle. For Henry and his friends, the criminal world seemed better than the ordinary life of working people. They looked down on people who followed the rules, worked regular jobs, saved money, and waited patiently for success. To them, those people were wasting their lives. They wanted fast money, power, and excitement, and they believed crime was the way to achieve it. The most important thing that gave these young criminals power was violence. They were not necessarily the smartest or richest people, but they were willing to use violence without hesitation. Breaking bones, threatening people, and even killing became normal parts of their world. Their reputation for violence created fear, and that fear gave them control. People knew that if they challenged them, there would be consequences. Violence was not just something they used. It was the foundation of their reputation. Interestingly, the neighborhood often protected these criminals. Many ordinary residents knew them personally. They had grown up together, attended the same schools, and shared the same streets. Even people who were not involved in crime often looked the other way, because these criminals were part of the community. The mob also created a strange sense of security in the neighborhood. Crime from outsiders, such as random robberies or street attacks, was rare because criminals controlled the area and watched everything happening around them. Everyone noticed unfamiliar cars, strangers, or anything unusual. Henry described how the neighborhood was always watching. People in bars, shops, and clubs kept an eye on the streets. Everyone knew who belonged and who did not. One night, Henry witnessed how quickly the neighborhood criminals reacted when they believed someone was threatening a local woman. A stranger followed a woman named Teresa home from the subway. The neighborhood immediately noticed him because nobody recognized him. Within moments, the local Wiseguys moved into action. They rushed after the man, attacked him inside the building, and threw him out of the window. Henry watched as the criminal world around him showed its power and violence. This event showed Henry that the neighborhood had its own rules. The police and official systems were not always the ones controlling justice. Instead, the criminals believed they were the ones protecting their territory. When Henry turned 17, he joined the paratroopers in the army. This happened during a difficult time for organized crime. After the famous Appalachian meeting in 1957, authorities increased their investigations into the Mafia. The government began publicly acknowledging the existence of organized crime and investigating its connections with unions and businesses. Henry thought joining the army would give him a break from the streets, and surprisingly, he loved military life. It was the first time he had been away from his neighborhood. He had never experienced nature, camping, or many normal activities, but he enjoyed the discipline and challenges of army training. Even in the army, however, Henry's criminal mindset continued. He quickly found ways to make money. While working in the kitchen, he noticed that the army ordered much more food than it needed. Instead of throwing away the extra supplies, Henry started selling them to restaurants and businesses. He sold everything from meat and eggs to butter, sauces, and other supplies. The restaurants appreciated his business, and Henry made a lot of money, while also receiving free drinks and special treatment. Henry also started illegal lending among soldiers. He noticed that many soldiers ran out of money before payday, so he began lending money with high interest. He also organized card games and dice games, then lent money to people who lost. Once again, Henry recreated the same world he knew from Brooklyn. Even far away from home, he built a small criminal business around himself. Throughout his time in the army, Henry stayed connected with Paul Vario and Tutty. They continued supporting him, even helping him when he got into trouble. When Henry was arrested after a bar fight, Paul helped him get released because Henry knew he could not ask his parents for help. After about 6 months, Henry managed to return to New York. When he arrived at the pizzeria, everyone welcomed him like a hero. They joked about his army uniform and haircut, but they were happy to see him back. Henry brought them alcohol and stories from the army. He talked about ways he could make money by bringing back cheap cigarettes and other items. Paul Vario seemed proud of him. Before Henry returned to duty, Paul gave him a gift in front of everyone. Henry opened the package and found a large rear-view mirror used by truck drivers to see vehicles behind them. Paul told him to put in his car because it would help him notice if someone was following him. The gift represented more than just a mirror. It showed that Henry was no longer just a kid from the neighborhood. He was becoming part of a world where watching others, avoiding police, and staying alert were essential skills. By the end of the chapter, Henry's transformation was clear. He had grown up in a place where crime was normal, where criminals were respected, and where violence was a language everyone understood. Even when he entered the army, he carried the same mindset with him, finding opportunities, making money, and staying connected to the criminal world that had shaped him. Chapter 4. After leaving the army in 1963, Henry Hill returned to the streets of Brooklyn. Although he had enjoyed military life, he quickly realized that his real world was still the neighborhood, the cab stand, and the people connected to Paul Vario. His time away had not changed him. Instead, it had given him more confidence and experience. Before leaving the army completely, Henry had already started getting into trouble. After his kitchen sergeant disappeared with a large amount of his money, Henry became frustrated. Then, only months before his discharge, he got drunk and started a violent fight in a bar with 3 Marines. The fight became a disaster, with broken bottles, destroyed mirrors, and blood everywhere. When the sheriff arrived, Henry managed to escape and even drove away in the sheriff's own car. The military took the situation seriously and sent people from Fort Bragg to bring him back. As a result, Henry spent the final months of his military career in the stockade, lost his benefits, and was reduced in rank. However, in Henry's world, being locked up was not something shameful. He saw it almost as a sign of experience, similar to how criminals viewed prison time. When Henry returned home, he became close with Lenny Vario, Paul Vario's teenage son. Lenny was only 16, but already acted older than his age. He was strong, confident, and had a personality similar to his father. Paul considered him his favorite son because he believed Lenny had the qualities needed to become a powerful figure in the criminal world. Since Paul Vario was away in prison, Lenny and Henry became partners. They spent almost all their time together. Henry needed a job, but he had no interest in returning to small tasks around the cab stand. Through Paul's influence, they both received jobs as union bricklayers, earning good money. The jobs were not earned through hard work or qualifications. Paul used his connections with the Bricklayers Union to arrange positions for them. Henry's father was actually proud because construction work was respected in the neighborhood, but Henry never intended to build a career as a worker. Instead, Henry and Lenny treated the job as another opportunity. They rarely showed up, did almost no work, and collected their paychecks through other workers. They spent their money on parties, clothes, gambling, and entertainment. They did not even bother paying union dues. Eventually, the union became frustrated because their behavior was causing problems. Builders were becoming suspicious, and the union leaders asked Paul to deal with them. Paul solved the problem by moving them into a different world. Instead of working construction, he got them jobs at a luxurious restaurant called the Azores, located near the Lido Beach Hotel. This was Henry's first real experience with a wealthy lifestyle. Lenny worked as a bartender, even though he was too young, while Henry became the restaurant's maitre d' and wore a tuxedo despite having no real experience. The reason Paul arranged these jobs was not simply to help them. The restaurant was connected to powerful Mafia figures, including Thomas Lucchese, the boss of the entire Lucchese crime family. Lucchese visited the restaurant regularly, and Paul wanted Lenny to be close to him and learn from being around important people. Henry and Lenny treated Lucchese like royalty. His seat was always prepared. His drink was ready immediately, and everyone made sure he received special treatment. Lucchese was one of the most powerful men in New York. He controlled large parts of the garment industry, had influence over unions, businesses, and politicians, and had connections throughout the city. Because Henry was seen talking with Lucchese, wealthy businessmen began treating him differently. They wanted his attention because they believed he had influence. They gave him business cards, offered favors, and even handed him large tips. For Henry, this was his first taste of a completely different lifestyle. He saw rich businessmen, expensive homes, luxury cars, and wealthy families. He realized that the criminal world gave him access to places and people he never imagined as a child. However, behind the luxury, the restaurant was still controlled by criminals. The official owner was only a front man. Wise guys often could not put their names on businesses, so they used other people to appear as the owners while secretly collecting profits. The restaurant owner had to pay the criminals first, no matter whether business was good or bad. This was the reality of having mafia partners. They always got their money. Henry and Lenny made the situation worse by stealing from the restaurant, giving away free food and drinks, and acting disrespectfully. The owner hated them but could not challenge them because of their connection to Paul. By the end of the summer, Henry and Lenny became bored. They left the restaurant after a violent incident with the chef. The chef constantly treated them badly, and one day Henry and Lenny lost control. They grabbed him and threatened to put him inside a hot oven. After the incident, Paul was furious because they had embarrassed him in front of important people. As punishment, he ordered Henry to burn Lenny's beloved car. This showed Henry an important lesson about their world. Even family members were not protected from consequences if they damaged the organization's reputation. After leaving the restaurant, Henry became involved in many more criminal schemes. One of his biggest businesses involved stolen credit cards. Henry had contacts inside companies and banks who helped him obtain information and duplicate cards. He would use the cards to buy expensive items before they were reported stolen. He created fake identities and documents, then worked with stores where employees were willing to cooperate. The stolen merchandise included televisions, stereos, watches, and other valuable goods. After using the cards, Henry sold them to other criminals who specialized in making small purchases under the credit limits, so they could avoid detection. Henry also became involved in cigarette smuggling. Jimmy Burke introduced him to the business by giving him cartons of cigarettes to sell. Because cigarettes were much cheaper in southern states than in New York due to taxes, Henry could make large profits. He quickly discovered how easy the business was. Construction workers and factory employees bought the cigarettes because they saved money, while Henry made a profit from every carton. Soon, Henry expanded the operation. He worked with Tommy DeSimone and began selling hundreds of cartons every day. Eventually, they traveled to other states, bought thousands of cartons, and transported them back to New York. The business became so profitable that they bought their own trucks. However, as more criminals entered the cigarette business, competition increased and profits declined. Henry also entered the stolen car business. Through a connection with an importer in Haiti, he stole cars from New York streets and exported them overseas. He paid young neighborhood criminals to steal the vehicles, change their identification information, and sold them for profit. At the same time, Henry continued working closely with Paul Vario. He drove Paul around all day and watched how Paul managed his criminal organization. Paul controlled many different illegal businesses, gambling operations, stolen cars, loan sharks, unions, and hijacking operations. The people working under him operated almost like independent businesses, but everyone paid Paul a percentage of their earnings. Henry explained that Paul's main service was protection. Criminals who could not go to the police needed someone powerful to protect them from other criminals. Paul also maintained relationships with corrupt police officers, politicians, businessmen, and union officials. These connections helped the organization survive and expand. Despite being only a street-level criminal, Henry was already making a lot of money. He was involved in many activities at once: stealing, gambling, lending money, cigarette smuggling, and insurance-related crimes. He also became involved in schemes where restaurants and businesses were pressured into working with Paul's organization. Criminals would create problems for business owners, Then Paul would step in as the person who could solve those problems. In reality, Paul would become a hidden partner, taking money from the business while offering protection. Henry also became deeply involved in gambling. He placed huge bets on sports, horse racing, and card games. He knew people who had inside information and could predict outcomes. One of these people was Richie Perry, a gambling expert who studied sports and racing carefully. Perry even developed methods to influence betting results in horse races by working with people involved in the races. Eventually, authorities discovered these gambling operations and arrested many people involved. Some avoided punishment, while others received prison sentences. By the end of the chapter, Henry had fully transformed from a neighborhood kid into a professional criminal. He was no longer simply following older criminals. He was building his own businesses, making large amounts of money and becoming an important part of Paul Vario's organization. The criminal world had become Henry's career, and every new opportunity only pulled him deeper into it. Chapter 5. In 1965, Henry Hill was 22 years old, single, and enjoying his life completely. He lived every day surrounded by excitement, money, and criminal activities. For Henry and the people around him, the most important thing was not saving money or building a normal future. The important thing was making money quickly and enjoying it immediately. Henry could make a lot of money from his different schemes, but he never kept it for long. After a successful deal, he might have pockets full of cash, but only a few days later he would be broke again. He spent his money in nightclubs, restaurants, and bars, giving large tips and showing everyone that he had money. He had no real responsibilities, no bills, no bank accounts, and no plans for the future. His life was always unpredictable. He could spend his day at the cab stand, travel with Paulie to solve problems, go with Jimmy Burke on cigarette deals, or suddenly find himself somewhere else because of another opportunity. Henry enjoyed this lifestyle because every day brought something new. He never knew where he would end up at night. At that time, Henry was also enjoying being single. He met many different women and spent time with them in clubs, restaurants, and parties. He liked the freedom of his life and felt that he had everything he wanted. One day, while Henry was at the cab stand, Paulie Vario's son Paul Jr. came looking for him. Paul wanted Henry to go on a double date with him because he wanted to take a girl named Diane out, but needed someone else to come along. Henry was busy with his own deals, but he agreed to help. The other girl on the date was Karen. At first, Karen did not like Henry. She thought he was rude because he seemed distracted and impatient. He kept looking at the time and wanted to leave quickly because he had other things to do. After that night, Henry did not show up for their next date, which made Karen angry. Later, Karen confronted Henry on the street and told him that nobody had the right to stand her up. Henry explained himself and promised to make it up to her. This time, he took her seriously, and their relationship started to develop. Henry took Karen to a Chinese restaurant, and then to nightclubs where everyone knew him. Karen noticed that Henry was different from other young men she had dated. He seemed confident, experienced, and respected by everyone around him. People greeted him, treated him well, and wanted to talk to him. Karen was impressed by the lifestyle Henry showed her. She saw expensive clubs, famous places, and people who seemed important. She did not realize that Henry's influence came from his connection to organized crime. When Henry first went to meet Karen's parents, there was a problem. Karen's family was Jewish and did not like the idea that Henry was not Jewish. Henry tried to explain that he was partly Jewish, but they were still unsure about him. When he arrived at their house wearing expensive clothes and a large gold cross, Karen became nervous because her religious grandmother might see it. She quickly asked him to turn the cross around before entering. Despite the difficulties between their families, Henry and Karen became closer. Karen introduced Henry to a different world, including wealthy people, country clubs, and a lifestyle he had never experienced before. Henry realized that there were many things rich people did that he did not know how to do, such as playing golf, swimming, or tennis. Henry also introduced Karen to his own world. They went to clubs where he knew the owners and workers. They attended weddings with people connected to Paulie's crew. Karen was fascinated because Henry always seemed important wherever they went. Their relationship became stronger after an incident involving a man named Steve. Steve had known Karen for years, but one day he tried to force himself on her. Karen fought back and escaped, but she was frightened and embarrassed. Instead of calling her family, she called Henry. When Henry heard what happened, he became furious. He immediately wanted revenge. He went to Steve's house with a gun and attacked him. He threatened him and scared him badly before leaving. The police arrived, but Henry stayed calm and denied having a weapon. Karen hid the gun, and the police could not find any evidence against him. Karen was shocked by what happened, but she also felt that Henry had protected her. The incident made her feel closer to him because she believed he cared about her. After months of problems with their families, Henry decided that the only solution was marriage. He and Karen secretly traveled to North Carolina and got married. When they returned and told their families, everyone was surprised, but eventually they accepted the situation. Karen's parents allowed them to live in their house. They believed Henry was a normal working man because he had a union card and claimed to be a bricklayer. They never realized that his money actually came from criminal activities. Henry tried to become part of Karen's family and even started religious lessons because he wanted to convert. By the end of the chapter, Henry and Karen had a Jewish wedding, and their families slowly accepted him. However, while Henry appeared to be becoming a normal husband, he continued living the dangerous life of a gangster. His marriage gave him a new image, but his criminal world remained the foundation of his life. Chapter 6. After Henry and Karen got married, Karen slowly began to discover that the man she loved was not exactly the person she thought he was. At first, Karen knew that Henry was different from the other young men she had grown up with. She knew he was tough, confident, and that he had many friends who were not ordinary people. She had seen him fight before. She had seen him stand against 3 men outside a nightclub in Manhattan, using a tire iron. She knew that some of his friends had spent time in prison, and she knew that Henry sometimes carried a gun. But even with all that, Karen still did not truly understand what kind of world Henry belonged to. During the early 1960s, people outside that world did not really know much about organized crime. The public image of gangsters had not become as famous as it would later become through movies and books. To Karen, Henry was simply a man who worked as a bricklayer and had a position in a construction union. She believed that his money came from normal work. Sometimes she even drove him to construction sites and watched him walk inside. He brought home a weekly salary. They were paying for furniture, and he had a brand new car. Everything looked normal on the surface, but there were things that did not completely make sense. Karen knew that Henry had once made thousands of dollars through illegal gambling before they got married. She knew his friends seemed to have more money than their jobs could explain. They worked as construction workers, truck drivers, restaurant owners, and airport workers, but somehow they always had expensive cars and plenty of cash. Still, Karen tried not to think too much about it. Karen begins accepting Henry's lifestyle. Karen's mother never liked Henry. From the beginning, she believed Henry was not the right man for her daughter. She thought he drank too much, stayed out too late, and spent time with dangerous people. But Karen refused to accept that her mother might be right. The more her mother criticized Henry, the more Karen defended him. She did not want to admit that she had made a mistake. She did not want her mother to feel that she had won. So Karen began making excuses. If Henry came home late, she told herself he was just with his friends. If he did not call, she found a reason for it. If something suspicious happened, she tried to explain it away. Slowly, without realizing it, Karen started changing. The things that once seemed strange slowly became normal. She later admitted that the change did not happen in one big moment. It happened little by little, day after day, until she became part of that world, the gun and the excitement of danger. One of the moments that showed how much Karen was becoming connected to Henry's lifestyle was when Henry gave her a gun to hide. Many women would have been frightened. They might have immediately left a man who handed them a weapon. But Karen admitted something different. The experience excited her. The danger, the feeling that Henry was powerful and could protect her, made her feel special. She was attracted to the excitement surrounding him. She was not only falling in love with Henry, she was also becoming fascinated by the world around him, meeting the wives of Henry's friends. A few months after their marriage, Karen attended a party at the home of Helene, the wife of Bobby DeSimone, one of Henry's friends. This was the first time Karen spent time with the wives without Henry being there. She entered their world and immediately noticed that it was completely different from the life she knew. The women were friendly and welcomed her, making her feel like she belonged. But then she started listening to their conversations. She was shocked. They talked openly about husbands who were in prison. Karen had never been around people who spoke about jail so casually. The women did not discuss what their husbands had done. They never focused on the crimes. Instead, they talked about how their husbands were treated unfairly, how police officers and prosecutors were against them, and how unlucky they were to get caught. To them, prison was almost a normal part of life. They talked about visiting their husbands, traveling long distances to see them, and trying to survive while their husbands were away. Karen could not believe it, seeing the reality behind the money. As Karen spent more time around these families, she began noticing things she had ignored before. Many of the women looked tired. Some were poorly dressed. Some had health problems. Their children often had serious behavior problems. They fought, skipped school, disappeared from home, and caused trouble. Karen realized that behind the expensive cars and the money, many of these families were struggling. The lifestyle looked glamorous from the outside, but inside it was filled with stress, fear, and problems. Henry tries to calm her fears. When Karen went home and told Henry what she had seen, she was worried. But Henry did not see the danger. He told her that she was overreacting. He explained that many people were involved in illegal businesses, but very few of them went to prison. He talked about the money they made from gambling, stolen goods, cigarettes, and other schemes. He also told her that they knew good lawyers and people who could help them if problems happened. Henry made everything sound easy, and Karen wanted to believe him. She loved him, and she also loved the exciting lifestyle that came with him. Henry's friends did not look like criminals. One of the reasons Karen struggled to understand the truth was because Henry's friends did not look like the criminals she imagined. They looked like ordinary working men. Some owned restaurants. Some worked with cars. Some had businesses. They worked hard and were always busy making money. To Karen, they did not look like the dangerous people described in newspapers. She saw men with expensive clothes and new cars, but she also saw their problems. Some lived in poor neighborhoods. Some had unhappy families. She started to notice that the world they lived in was full of contradictions. Henry's arrest. Eventually, Henry's illegal activities caught up with him. One day, Henry was with his friends at Jimmy Burke's house. They were gambling and waiting for a shipment of stolen cigarettes. When the shipment arrived, they discovered that it did not include the brand they wanted. Jimmy asked Henry to travel to Baltimore and bring back more cigarettes. Henry agreed. He took his friend Lenny and drove there. They planned to return quickly, but they wasted time drinking and visiting clubs. By the time they picked up the cigarettes, they were already late. They loaded hundreds of cartons into the car and tried to hide them. On the way back, Henry drove very fast because he wanted to arrive before his customers expected him. But near New Jersey, a police officer stopped him. The officer became suspicious because Henry could not explain who owned the car. Then he saw the cigarettes. Henry and Lenny were arrested. Karen learns more about Henry's real life. When Henry called Karen and told her about the arrest, she was embarrassed and scared. She still believed Henry was mainly a construction worker. She knew he did things that were not completely legal, but she did not fully understand how serious it was. Everyone around her acted like the arrest was nothing important. They told her it was just business. They told her Jimmy would take care of everything. Slowly, Karen started accepting things that she would have never accepted before. Henry's disappearing nights. After marriage, Henry often stayed out late. One night, he did not come home at all. Karen waited nervously. Her mother saw the opportunity to prove her point. She stayed awake, waiting for Henry to return. Hours passed. The family sat together, waiting. Finally, early in the morning, Henry arrived in a car with some of his friends. When he saw Karen's mother standing there angry and questioning him, he decided not to argue. He simply turned around and left. Karen was hurt, but at the same time, she felt that she and Henry were together against everyone else. Even conflict made their relationship stronger, the secret rules of their world. Later, Karen discovered another uncomfortable truth about the men around Henry. Many of them had girlfriends besides their wives. There was an unwritten rule. Friday nights were for girlfriends. Saturday nights were for wives. The wives often knew about it, but rarely talked about it. One night, Karen saw one of Henry's friends with another woman at a club. She knew his wife. She felt uncomfortable and trapped because she was now part of a world where things that once seemed unacceptable had become normal. Chapter 7. In the early 1950s, the old Idlewild golf course in Queens was transformed into a gigantic airport. What looked like a legitimate center of transportation to ordinary people quickly became something completely different to the neighborhood criminals. The airport was enormous. Thousands of acres, tens of thousands of workers, countless cargo areas, trucks, warehouses, loading platforms, and gates. For the local Wiseguys, it was almost like a city within a city. They began learning the airport the way a businessman would learn his own company. They knew the back roads, the cargo terminals, the freight offices, and the places where security was weak. Even men who could barely read learned how the shipping system worked. They learned about bills of lading, shipping manifests, and invoices. More importantly, they discovered that valuable information about incoming cargo was sitting in poorly protected offices. Shipping brokers kept paperwork that revealed exactly what valuable goods were arriving and where they would be stored. And someone was always willing to provide information. A worker who owed money to a bookmaker or loan shark could pay off his debt by giving the gang information about an expensive shipment. One truck driver, for example, agreed to accidentally drop mail pouches along a road near the airport. Those pouches turned out to contain $2 million in cash, money orders, and stocks. By the early 1960s, billions of dollars worth of cargo were passing to the airport every year. To Jimmy Burke and his crew, it looked less like an airport and more like an enormous warehouse full of opportunities. Jimmy became the central figure in this operation. His crew stole almost anything valuable they could get their hands on: furs, diamonds, securities, guns, cash, and other expensive cargo. The airport also became a place where stolen credit cards could be turned into money. The gang would use them to purchase airline tickets, then either cash the tickets in or sell them cheaply to people who wanted discounted travel. Some of their customers were perfectly respectable people who had no idea where the tickets came from. One notable customer was Tino Barzi. The manager of Frank Sinatra Jr. Barzi reportedly bought more than $50,000 worth of discounted airline tickets and used them to move Sinatra and his entourage around the country. Eventually, he was caught and convicted. But the airport wasn't simply a place for theft. It was becoming a place of fear. People who talked too much or went to police could become targets. According to the chapter, informants and potential witnesses were sometimes murdered, while corrupt police officers on Burke's payroll warned him when someone might testify against him. Bodies were discovered in stolen cars abandoned around the airport's parking areas. The message was clear. Inside Jimmy Burke's world, silence was not optional. Henry Hill, Tommy DeSimone, Angelo Sepe, Skinny Bobby Amelia, Stanley Diamond, Joey Allegro, and others became part of this growing airport operation. Jimmy Burke had taken ordinary theft and turned it into something much larger and more organized. But among all the crimes, there was one thing Jimmy particularly loved: hijacking. For Jimmy, hijacking wasn't merely business. He seemed to genuinely enjoy it. When a newly stolen truck arrived, Henry would watch Jimmy tear into boxes like a child opening Christmas presents. He wanted to see everything. He would open crates, touch the stolen merchandise, inspect it, lift things in his hands, and carry them away. Jimmy could have hired people to unload the trucks, and often did, but Henry believed there was something almost joyful about watching Jimmy do it himself. For all his business instincts, however, Jimmy was also one of the most feared men in the criminal world. His reputation for violence had started during his years in prison. Stories circulated that he had committed killings for powerful mob figures while inside. His temper was so explosive that even dangerous criminals were afraid of him. What made Jimmy especially disturbing was a strange contrast in his personality. He could be generous one moment and brutally violent the next. One story described how Jimmy gave $5,000 to the elderly mother of a young criminal because her son had supposedly refused to repay money he owed her. Jimmy apparently considered disrespect toward one's mother unforgivable. He gave the woman the money in the morning, claiming it came from her son. By the end of that same day, according to the story, her son was dead. Then came 1962. Jimmy was preparing to marry Mickey, but Mickey had an old boyfriend who wouldn't leave her alone. He called her, harassed her, drove around her house, and continued bothering her. Jimmy took the problem personally, and on the very day Jimmy and Mickey were married, police discovered the boyfriend's remains. His body had been brutally dismembered and scattered throughout his car. For Henry Hill, this was Jimmy Burke, a man who could turn an airport into his personal hunting ground, transform stolen cargo into an empire, and combine charm and generosity with terrifying violence. The airport had given Jimmy a kingdom, and Jimmy Burke was determined to rule it. Jimmy Burke's reputation wasn't built only on violence. What truly impressed the leaders of organized crime was his extraordinary ability to make money. He was so valuable that something almost unheard of happened. The Colombo crime family in Brooklyn and the Lucchese crime family in Queens actually negotiated an arrangement to share Jimmy's services. That was remarkable because Jimmy wasn't even Italian. He was Irish. Two Italian-controlled crime families sitting down together to negotiate over the services of an Irish criminal showed just how valuable Jimmy had become. But despite his growing reputation, almost nobody actually knew Jimmy Burke. In fact, Jimmy barely knew himself. He didn't know exactly where or when he had been born, and he had never known his biological parents. According to records from a Manhattan foundling home, he was born on July 5, 1931, to a woman named Conway. When Jimmy was only 2 years old, he was classified as a neglected child and placed into the Roman Catholic foster care system. What followed was a brutal childhood. For the next 11 years, Jimmy was moved from one foster home to another. He lived with dozens of different families, never having the stability of a real home or permanent parents. By September 1949, Jimmy Burke had already spent much of his young life being beaten, arrested, and sent from one juvenile institution to another. He had served time in places such as Elmira, and prison was becoming less of an interruption in his life and more of a permanent part of it. Then, at 18, Jimmy was arrested again. This time, he had been caught trying to pass $3,000 worth of fraudulent checks at a bank in Queens. Jimmy hadn't designed the entire operation himself. Because he was young and had an innocent-looking face, a Brooklyn criminal named Dominic Chirami had used him as the person who actually presented the checks. Chirami ran a professional gang specializing in cashing fraudulent checks. The police wanted Chirami, so they took Jimmy to the second floor of the 75th Precinct in Queens. There, detectives handcuffed him with his hands behind his back and began punching him in the stomach. They wanted Jimmy to give them information about Chirami and the operation. But Jimmy refused. He took the beating and said nothing. Eventually, he was sentenced to 5 years at Auburn Prison for bank forgery. He was only 18, and this was his first time entering an adult prison. When Jimmy arrived at Auburn, he entered a massive stone prison surrounded by steel gates in the freezing landscape of upstate New York. But he wasn't alone. More than a dozen of the prison's toughest inmates were waiting in the reception area. 2 men approached him. They were friends of Dominic Chirami, and they had heard what Jimmy had done. Jimmy had protected Chirami by refusing to talk, and these men appreciated his loyalty. They told him that if he ever needed anything inside Auburn, he could come to them. For Jimmy, this was an important moment. He had met the mob, and the man who would eventually become one of the most powerful criminals around Kennedy Airport was beginning to build relationships that would follow him for decades. One person who knew Jimmy described his personality in simple terms. Jimmy loved stealing. It wasn't merely a way to make money for him. It was almost his entire identity. As a child, he stole food. He robbed drunk people. He lived on the streets and slept wherever he could, sometimes in parked cars. Around Aqueduct, he had a few places where he could sleep and wash. Whenever authorities caught him, he would be sent back to the foundling home, a foster family, or a reform school. Eventually, he would run away again. Then he would steal again. The cycle continued. Between the ages of 16 and 22, Jimmy spent only 86 days outside jail. Think about that. For roughly 6 years, his life consisted almost entirely of two things: prison, or stealing and running from the authorities. And eventually, prison stopped frightening him. The bars became almost invisible to him. He had lived behind them so often that they no longer represented the same barrier they represented to ordinary people. According to the account, Jimmy had become almost psychologically immune to prison. He simply continued, and that mentality would later make him extremely dangerous. Jimmy takes over Kennedy Airport. By 1970, Jimmy Burke had essentially become the dominant figure in hijacking operations at Kennedy Airport. Paul Vario had given him approval, but Jimmy himself controlled the operation. He decided which shipments were worth stealing. He decided when they should be taken. He selected the people who would participate in each job, and he arranged the people who would receive and dispose of the stolen merchandise afterward. The airport had become Jimmy's personal source of wealth, and there was a reason he understood it so well. He and the other criminals had grown up around it. Their friends worked there. Their relatives worked there. People they knew worked there. So they knew what was coming in and what was going out. To Jimmy, the airport wasn't some mysterious high-security facility. It was practically his neighborhood. The comparison in the story is striking. To Jimmy, Kennedy Airport was better than a bank. Whenever he needed money, he knew where to go. The operation depended on a huge network of people inside the airport. There were employees of the airlines. There were people connected to the Port Authority. There were maintenance workers and cleaning crews. There were security guards. There were restaurant workers. And there were truck drivers and dispatchers working for the companies transporting air cargo. All of these connections meant that Jimmy could obtain information about valuable shipments before they moved. The airport had effectively become an enormous criminal marketplace, and the money coming from stolen cargo and hijacked trucks eventually became even more profitable than their numbers operations. The power behind the operation. But the most important part wasn't simply having people inside the airport. It was protecting those people. Suppose a trucking company manager became suspicious that one of his employees was secretly providing information to Jimmy's crew. If the manager tried to fire that employee, the problem didn't end there. The criminals could take the issue to Paul Vario. Vario could then take it to Johnny Dio, who controlled important union connections. Suddenly, what looked like an ordinary workplace firing became a union dispute. The union could threaten a grievance. It could threaten a strike. It could threaten to shut down the trucking operation. The company would quickly find itself facing pressure from people far more powerful than one employee. Eventually, the trucking companies learned a lesson. It was easier to let the insurance companies pay for the losses than to fight the criminals controlling the operation. And that was the real strength of Jimmy Burke's empire. It wasn't simply that he could steal cargo. It was that he had built a network around the airport. Workers, informants, unions, criminals, and people willing to look the other way. Jimmy had spent his childhood running from institutions. Now, as an adult, he had created something very different, an institution of his own. In 1966, Henry Hill was 23 years old when he took part in his first hijacking. Technically, it wasn't a classic hijacking. The trucks weren't moving on the highway. They were sitting inside a freight garage near the airport. But legally, it was still a serious felony. Jimmy Burke had invited Henry to join the job. Jimmy had learned that 3 cargo trucks loaded with home appliances were going to be left inside a freight garage over the weekend. More importantly, he already had a buyer waiting. A friend of Tuddy Vario was prepared to pay $5,000 for each truck. So before the robbery even happened, Jimmy already knew 3 important things: what they were stealing, where it was, and who would buy it. The garage was barely protected. On Friday night, only one elderly watchman was working there, and his main responsibility was preventing young vandals from causing trouble. Henry simply walked up to the gate and told the guard that he had accidentally left his paycheck inside one of the trucks. The guard opened the gate. That was his mistake. As soon as the gate opened, Henry threatened him, then tied him to a chair inside a nearby shack. Jimmy already knew the layout of the garage. He knew exactly where the keys were kept and exactly where the trucks were parked. Within minutes, Henry, Jimmy, and Tommy DeSimone had the 3 trucks moving. They drove through the industrial streets of Canarsie toward Flatlands Avenue, where Tutty and the buyer were waiting. The whole thing was incredibly fast. There was no complicated operation, no long confrontation, and no dramatic chase. They simply took the trucks and delivered them to the waiting buyer. For Henry, it was the easiest $5,000 he had ever made. And the criminals didn't waste the money. Within an hour, Henry, Jimmy, and Tommy were heading to Las Vegas for the weekend. Jimmy had already arranged their hotel reservations under false names. For Henry, this was his introduction to a completely different kind of criminal business, hijacking to order. Henry later explained that most of their hijackings weren't random. They weren't simply driving around looking for something valuable to steal. The cargo was usually already chosen. They knew what they wanted before the robbery. They knew where it was. And they already knew where it was going afterward. In other words, the robberies were essentially hijacks to order. The stolen goods already had buyers waiting. That made the operation much more like a business than random theft. According to Henry, they could carry out 2 or 3 jobs a week, and whenever they urgently needed money. They could do even more, sometimes as many as 2 jobs in a single day. Their usual starting point was Robert's, a bar Jimmy owned on Lefferts Boulevard in South Ozone Park. Robert's wasn't an ordinary neighborhood bar. It was practically a headquarters for the criminal world surrounding the airport. Inside were card tables, a craps table, bookmakers, loan sharks, truck drivers, freight handlers, cargo dispatchers, and airport workers. There were people gambling away their paychecks before the weekend had even properly started. A truck driver might lose his entire Friday paycheck at Robert's. But then, if that same driver gave Jimmy's crew information about a valuable shipment coming to the airport, one good tip could make up for several lost paychecks, and perhaps erase debts he owed to the wrong people. That was what made Robert's so useful. It wasn't just a bar. It was an information exchange. People connected to the airport came through the doors. Jimmy's crew could hear what cargo was arriving, which trucks were moving, which shipments were valuable, and where opportunities were appearing. And the location was perfect. Roberts was close to the Van Wyck Expressway, giving them quick access to Kennedy Airport's cargo area. It was also near Aqueduct Racetrack, Paulie Vario's office at the Bargain Auto Junkyard on Flatlands Avenue, and the Queens County Courts, where their lawyers could obtain postponements. So Henry's world was becoming increasingly organized. The airport provided the cargo. The workers provided information. Roberts provided the meeting place. Jimmy provided the organization. Tutty and the other fences provided buyers. And the courts, through their connections, could sometimes buy them time when legal trouble appeared. What had started as a simple robbery of 3 trucks was becoming something much larger. For Henry Hill, the first hijacking wasn't just his first serious robbery. It was his first real glimpse of how an organized criminal enterprise could operate like a business. By the 1960s, Kennedy Airport had become far more than an airport to the men around Henry Hill. To them, it was almost an enormous warehouse filled with opportunities. They knew the roads, the cargo areas, the workers, the security routines, and, most importantly, the people who could tell them what was coming in and going out. Jimmy Burke stood at the center of this operation. His crew could obtain information about valuable shipments before the trucks even left the airport. Cargo could then disappear through theft, hijacking, or arrangements with drivers who were secretly cooperating with them. The business was so organized that the stolen merchandise usually already had a buyer before it was taken. The crew wasn't simply stealing random goods and hoping to find somewhere to sell them. They knew what they wanted, who wanted it, and where it would go afterward. There were legitimate-looking businesses and retailers willing to buy the merchandise cheaply. A network of middlemen, known as fences, helped distribute the stolen goods. Some sold them from trucks, some supplied stores, and others passed them on to people who wanted cheap merchandise. Henry eventually became an important part of this system because he was good at finding customers. He had already developed contacts through his cigarette business, and Jimmy encouraged him to use those connections to sell stolen merchandise as well. Some of Henry's customers were large enough to take huge quantities of goods. A drugstore wholesaler bought products such as razor blades, perfume, and cosmetics. Henry also had a connection inside a razor blade factory who secretly supplied him with cartons of blades. By selling them below normal wholesale prices, Henry could make hundreds of dollars a week from razor blades alone. Other buyers wanted completely different products. A furrier would purchase large quantities of mink, beaver, and fox pelts. A connection at the Fulton Fish Market could take frozen shrimp and lobster. Bars and restaurants could be supplied with stolen liquor at prices far below the legitimate market. This created an entire underground supply chain. At the same time, the hijackings themselves were carefully organized. Some were what the crew called give-ups. In these cases, the truck driver was secretly cooperating with them. Instead of fighting or being forced at gunpoint, the driver would deliberately create the appearance of a robbery. For example, leaving the truck unattended with the keys inside and then reporting it stolen. The other type was a genuine armed hijacking. Those jobs were carried out by men who were essentially hired muscle. They were paid a fixed amount for the robbery itself, rather than receiving a percentage of the stolen merchandise. Their job was simply to take control of the truck and its driver. The crew would know the truck they wanted, its cargo, its driver, and its destination. They would watch the truck and wait for the right opportunity to stop it. Once they had control, the driver would be threatened and taken away, while another crew drove the truck to a predetermined unloading location. Jimmy had already arranged the next stage before the robbery even happened. The stolen truck would usually be taken to a warehouse or trucking facility where the merchandise could be unloaded. The warehouse operators were paid for allowing the operation to happen. Local workers were brought in to unload everything, and once the truck was empty, it was abandoned. The operation therefore worked almost like a legitimate logistics company, except that every stage was built around stolen goods. Information, hijacking, transportation, unloading, distribution, sale. And Henry's role increasingly became the salesman. He wasn't necessarily the man carrying the gun or driving the stolen truck. His value was that he knew people who wanted the merchandise. He could turn stolen cargo into cash. That was what made the operation so profitable. Henry had already discovered that there was a huge market for cheap goods. If he could obtain merchandise for almost nothing and sell it to someone who could distribute it quickly, everyone involved could make money. And the more connections Henry developed, the deeper he became involved in Jimmy Burke's world. What had started with cigarettes was becoming something much larger. Henry was no longer simply hustling individual deals. He was becoming part of an organized system that could steal entire truckloads of merchandise and move them through an underground commercial network. The amount of stolen merchandise coming to the airport became almost impossible to comprehend. Every day, more goods arrived, and the crew had so much of it that Jimmy Burke's house could look like a department store. Even the basement of Robert's Lounge became so packed with stolen merchandise that there was barely enough space left for men to sit around and play cards. Cargo workers and freight foremen were already bringing stolen goods directly to them. In theory, the crew could simply sit back and wait. But that wasn't how they thought. To them, waiting for someone else to steal the merchandise wasn't enough. If there was valuable cargo available, they wanted to take the trucks themselves. Hijacking wasn't merely a way to make money anymore. It had become part of their lifestyle. One of the most important places in this underground economy was the Bamboo Lounge, located near the airport. From the outside, it looked like an extravagant nightclub, with zebra-striped seats, palm trees, and expensive cars parked outside. But inside, it functioned almost like an open marketplace for stolen merchandise. People from all parts of the business came there. Truckers, union representatives, wholesalers, discount store owners, insurance people, professional fences. They came looking for specific merchandise and negotiating prices. The place was so openly involved in the trade that there was barely an attempt to disguise what was happening. Buyers would discuss what they needed, sellers would discuss what they had, and people would arrange deals for stolen cargo almost as if they were conducting ordinary business. Certain types of cargo were particularly valuable. Clothing, seafood, fabrics, and cigarettes were among the most desirable. But the list went much further. Coffee, records, liquor, televisions, radios, appliances, meat, shoes, toys, jewelry, watches, and almost anything else that could be transported and resold. The crew learned that not all cargo was equally profitable. If they knew exactly what a truck was carrying, they could target the valuable shipments rather than stealing blindly. That was another reason they preferred organized hijackings. Then the business expanded into something even bigger. Sometimes stolen securities and bearer bonds entered the market. Buyers with connections to the financial world would purchase them and move them overseas. Because foreign banks might not know that the securities have been stolen, the bonds could sometimes be used as collateral for loans. Millions of dollars could therefore be created from stolen financial instruments. But Henry and his associates didn't fully understand the financial system behind those deals. They eventually realized that the sophisticated buyers were making far more money than they were. Henry later described themselves as being taken advantage of because they received only a fraction of the ultimate value. Despite the enormous scale of the operation, the legal consequences were surprisingly limited. During the 1960s and early 1970s, hijacking had become a major business, yet relatively few people went to prison for it. Airlines often preferred to minimize their reported losses and collect insurance rather than spend heavily on additional security. There were also disputes between the airlines and the unions about who was responsible for protecting cargo and drivers. And there was another major problem. New York had not properly established hijacking as its own specific crime. So when hijackers were arrested, prosecutors had to rely on other charges: robbery, kidnapping, possession of firearms, or possession of stolen property. The results were often weak. A legislative study from the period found that an overwhelming percentage of hijacking-related arrests ended either with dismissed charges or with relatively minor penalties, such as fines or probation. The book gives an example involving 8 men connected to the Roberts Lounge crew. They had been caught possessing more than $100,000 worth of stolen women's clothing. Each received a $2,500 fine and probation. And the remarkable part was what happened afterward. While still on probation, those same men were arrested 17 more times for offenses, including robbery, burglary, and possession of stolen property. Yet they continued receiving probation. And the remarkable part was what happened afterward. While still on probation, those same men were arrested 17 more times for offenses, including robbery, burglary, and possession of stolen property. Yet they continued receiving probation. For men like Henry, this gradually changed their entire attitude toward the law. At first, being arrested had been frightening. Eventually, it became routine. Henry became so familiar with police questioning lawyers, bail bondsmen, prosecutors, and court procedures that getting arrested was no longer something that terrified him. He still didn't want to get caught. Getting caught cost money. Lawyers had to be paid. Bondsmen had to be paid. Sometimes money had to be spent dealing with police, witnesses, and other people involved in the legal system. But the arrest itself wasn't the real problem anymore. Henry's biggest concern was losing time. He wanted his lawyers to arrange his court appearances efficiently so that he could spend as little time as possible away from his business. Court had become almost ordinary to him. For Henry and his friends, going to court was almost like going back to school. They were required to show up, sit through the process, and leave. The seriousness of the accusation seemed almost secondary. Sometimes they would spend more time deciding where they were going to eat lunch than thinking about the charges against them. And that reveals just how completely their world had changed. Crime had stopped feeling like crime to them. It had become business. The stolen merchandise, the buyers, the warehouses, the airport workers, the unions, the lawyers, the courts, all of it had become part of the same system. And Henry was becoming increasingly comfortable inside it. For Henry and the men around him, getting arrested no longer meant that everything was over. It simply meant that another problem had appeared, one that could usually be handled with enough money and the right connections. While a case dragged through courts, Henry's strategy was simple: stay out of jail and keep making money. He would keep paying his lawyer throughout the months or even years that a case remained unresolved. As long as he was free, he could continue working, making money, and using that money to protect himself. In Henry's world, the lawyer wasn't simply someone who represented you in court. A good lawyer had a network of contacts that could keep a defendant out on bail, delay proceedings, and prevent the case from reaching an aggressive judge who might actually send someone to prison. The lawyers also had private investigators working for them, many of whom were former police officers. These investigators already knew how the police worked because they had once been part of that world themselves. That created another layer of connections. A former cop might know an active cop. A lawyer might know a prosecutor. Someone in the crew might know a union official, and one connection could lead to another. According to Henry, the goal was often to create a weakness in the prosecution's case, something small enough that the defense could use it to escape. Evidence or testimony might be challenged, altered, or undermined. The objective wasn't necessarily to completely destroy the case. Sometimes all that was needed was one small opening, and if those methods failed and the case actually reached trial, there was still the jury. Henry describes jury selection as another opportunity to use connections. The defense could learn information about potential jurors, where they lived, where they worked, their families, and other personal details. For Henry, the most important question was often where the juror worked. A workplace could mean a union, and unions were places where his network was particularly strong. The crew and the lawyers would examine the list of potential jurors and start connecting names. I know this guy. I know that guy. I know the union boss. I know the shop steward. I know the delegate. Maybe someone knew the juror's brother. Maybe someone worked with the juror's friend. Maybe someone had a connection to the union where the juror worked. One connection led to another until eventually they found someone they trusted who could approach someone else they trusted. The entire process became a chain of relationships. And to Henry, there was nothing extraordinary about it. It was simply business. The most important thing was getting the legal problem out of the way so that he could return to what really mattered to him, making money. Because even while a criminal case was hanging over his head, Henry's mind was already somewhere else. He wanted to get back to the airport. There was cargo coming in. There was money to be made. And, in his mind, the sooner the case disappeared, the sooner he could return to stealing it. Chapter 8. By 1967, the theft of cargo at Kennedy Airport had become so widespread that the authorities finally began putting numbers on it. In October 1967, report revealed that more than $2.2 million worth of cargo had been stolen from Kennedy Airport in just 10 months. And even that number was incomplete. It didn't include hundreds of hijackings that happened outside the airport, thefts worth less than $1,000, or another $2.5 million in non-negotiable stock stolen from Trans World Airlines. The stolen goods were disappearing directly from the airport's own storage and security areas. Kennedy's Air Cargo Center was enormous. It consisted of 13 buildings spread across 159 acres and contained warehouses, loading ramps, airline facilities, custom services, and trucking companies. There were supposed to be plenty of people protecting it. The airlines had their own guards. Private detectives were hired to protect valuable cargo. The Port Authority had more than 100 police officers working there on an average day. Customs inspectors, FBI agents, and local police also passed through the facility. Yet the thieves continued operating. During those 10 months, 45 major robberies took place. Clothing disappeared. So did pearls, diamonds, watches, cigarettes, drugs, musical instruments, machinery, and other valuable cargo. But then something much bigger appeared. Cash. Nearly $500,000. The money belonged to Air France and was being temporarily stored in a cargo office, while a new secure room was being constructed. And this is where Henry Hill saw an opportunity. Henry had already been selling cigarettes at the airport, which gave him a legitimate reason to move around the cargo facilities. One of his regular customers was an Air France cargo foreman named Bobby McMahon, known as Frenchie. Frenchie wasn't just another airport employee. He knew the cargo operation extremely well. Because he worked nights and had considerable freedom inside the facility, he knew what was arriving, what was leaving, and where valuable shipments were being stored. He had already supplied Henry and Jimmy's crew with stolen merchandise before. One day, Frenchie told Henry about something much more valuable than perfume or clothing. Cash was coming into the airport. A new secure room was being built, but it wasn't finished yet. In the meantime, the money was being kept in the cargo office near the entrance. Frenchie explained that the cash arrived in large white canvas bags, each containing roughly $60,000. Several bags were arrived from overseas flights and normally remained there until armored trucks collected them the following morning. To Henry, the opportunity seemed enormous. He immediately went to Roberts and told Jimmy Burke. Jimmy trusted Frenchie's information, so a crew was assembled. Henry went with Raymond Montemurro, his brother Monty, and Tommy DeSimone. Johnny Savino and Jimmy were supposed to remain behind. They prepared the usual way, using rented cars and false license plates. Then they went to Air France. But when they arrived, something was wrong. There were far too many people inside. Instead of an almost empty office that they could easily control, there were 25 or 30 people moving around. Behind the cargo office was an enormous warehouse filled with pallets, crates, and boxes stacked almost to the ceiling. The crew looked at the situation and realized that taking control of the building would be far more complicated than they had expected, so they abandoned the robbery. But before leaving, they had already seen what they had come for. The canvas bags were sitting there against the wall. White bags, red seals, money inside, lots of it. They had walked away from the robbery, but the sight of those bags stayed in Henry's mind. He had seen something that made the airport's previous scores look small, and now Henry and Jimmy knew exactly where the money was. After the first failed attempt at the Air France cargo office, Henry went back to Frenchie. The problem was no longer finding the money. They already knew where it was. The real problem was timing. Frenchie couldn't predict exactly when the cash would arrive. Sometimes weeks could pass without a delivery. Then, suddenly, 2 shipments might arrive at once and be sent to the bank that same day. To Henry, the money was almost perfect. Large amounts of American currency, mostly in $50 and $100 bills, arriving from overseas. It seemed like the kind of score that could change everything. So Henry kept visiting the airport under the innocent excuse of selling cigarettes. Every time he saw Frenchie, they talked about the money and watched the construction of a new secure room. Eventually, the room was finished, but there was a problem. There were only 2 keys. One belonged to a private security guard who took his job extremely seriously. He kept the key attached to his belt and never allowed anyone else to possess it. Even Frenchie couldn't simply borrow it. Whenever Frenchie needed to enter the room, the guard would unlock the door himself, stand there while Frenchie worked, and then lock it again. The second key belonged to the supervisor, who worked during the daytime. Henry realized that simply stealing the guard's key wouldn't solve the problem. If they robbed him and took it, the company would probably change the locks, and then everyone would know that somebody had discovered the money. They needed a copy. So Henry and Frenchie began looking for a way to get close enough to the guard to copy his key without alerting anyone. Frenchie was given the task of becoming friendly with him. He learned where the guard lived and provided Henry with his address. One day, Henry and Raymond Montemurro waited for the guard to leave. They entered his apartment looking for the key. They searched everywhere. Drawers, furniture, every possible hiding place. Nothing. The guard apparently carried the key with him, even when he wasn't working. Henry was becoming frustrated. He knew there was potentially a fortune sitting inside the airport, but one ordinary security guard was standing between them and the money. Worse, Jimmy Burke was becoming impatient. Jimmy's attitude was becoming increasingly dangerous. The next time Frenchie told him the money was inside, he wanted to take the guard and force him to surrender the key. Henry understood what that could mean. If Jimmy got his way, the guard might not survive, so Henry looked for another solution. While examining the guard's apartment, Henry had noticed that the man lived alone and appeared lonely. He was a thin, quiet man in his 40s who spent his time reading magazines. Frenchie, on the other hand, was outgoing and charismatic. Henry realized that the guard might be susceptible to friendship, especially because Frenchie was the boss on the night shift. Henry suggested using that relationship to get closer to him. Frenchie began taking the guard out for drinks. During one of their nights together, the conversation gradually moved toward women and relationships. The guard became interested. Henry realized they had found a weakness. The next step was to introduce a woman who could attract the guard's attention. Frenchie arranged for a woman to meet him at the Jade East Motel. She was attractive and experienced in dealing with wealthy clients, and she immediately showed interest in the guard. Frenchie pretended that he needed to return to work, leaving the 2 of them together. But Henry didn't immediately try to take the key. He wanted to know something first. Could they actually manipulate the guard? That night gave him the answer. The guard was vulnerable, and now Henry knew that they had a way to get closer to the key without immediately resorting to violence. The plan was finally ready. After several failed attempts and careful preparation, Henry and Tommy had managed to obtain copies of the key that opened the room where the cash would be stored. Frenchie then delivered the news they had been waiting for. Between $400,000 and $700,000 in cash was expected at the airport the following Friday. This was no longer a rehearsal. This was the real job. They also had an important advantage. Because of a Jewish holiday, the bank would not collect the money until Monday afternoon instead of Sunday night. That meant the theft might not even be discovered for several days. For Henry and the crew, that delay made the opportunity even more attractive. But getting the key was only the first step. Henry, Tommy, and Frenchie had carefully tested their plan at the motel. The guard had been distracted, and Henry had secretly taken his entire key ring to a locksmith. They had copies made, and then returned the original keys exactly where they had been. The next morning, Frenchie tested the copied keys at the airport. One of them worked. Even better, he had seen the canvas bags of money already inside the room. Now the crew knew the cash was actually there. Frenchie also explained when the conditions would be most favorable. Just before midnight, there would be plenty of movement around the airport as employees changed shifts. At the same time, the guard responsible for the room would be away taking his coffee break on the other side of the warehouse. Everything seemed to be falling into place. For Henry, the waiting was almost unbearable. They had spent weeks watching, planning, testing, and manipulating the situation without knowing whether the money would ever arrive at the right time. Now they knew. The money was there. They had a working key. The guard would be away. And, most importantly, nobody would immediately realize that anything had disappeared. The robbery that had started as an idea was about to become a reality. They had only 12 hours left to carry out the plan. The narrator kept the key in his hand all day and, excited about what was coming, bought the biggest suitcase he could find to carry the money. At 11:40 on Saturday night, he and Tommy arrived at the cargo parking area in a rented car with fake plates. They waited for the shift change. Then the narrator walked toward the platform while Frenchie watched from nearby, pretending not to know him. He reached the steel door, pulled out the key, and unlocked it. Inside was a dark room that looked like a large closet. Using a small flashlight, he spotted 7 white canvas bags with red seals lying on the floor. He quickly opened his suitcase, placed all 7 bags inside, and walked out. The suitcase was so heavy that he could barely carry it. Yet, according to Frenchie, he looked as if he were leaving empty-handed. He was practically floating out of the building because he was so happy that the plan had worked. Chapter 9. As Henry had planned, the Air France robbery was not discovered until Monday afternoon. By Tuesday, newspapers were reporting that $480,000 had disappeared from the Air France cargo building at Kennedy Airport. Investigators searched the building, questioned employees, examined records, and even kept guards and workers there around the clock. But the money was already long gone. Before the theft was even discovered, Henry and his friends had already distributed $120,000 as tribute to the Mafia bosses who controlled the airport. They gave $60,000 to Sebastian, Buster, Alloy of the Colombo crime family, and another $60,000 to their own boss, Paul Vario. Henry explained that giving Buster his share was essentially insurance. They wanted to make sure the people controlling the airport remained satisfied. Paulie's share was different. He was their boss and protector. If another criminal crew had a problem with Henry and his friends, Paulie would defend them during Mafia meetings. The remaining money was pooled together. Henry did not simply take his share home because he knew that keeping large amounts of stolen cash around the house would be dangerous. Instead, Jimmy kept the money in bookmakers' safes, and Henry could withdraw money whenever he needed it. They wanted to enjoy some of their newfound wealth, but they also knew they could not suddenly start spending huge amounts of money without raising questions. So Henry, Jimmy, and Tommy took a trip to Las Vegas and spent around $20,000, then returned home bragging that they had won the money gambling. Henry bought a new 1967 gold Buick Riviera with a black roof, financing it under his brother's name. Tommy did something similar and bought a beige Cadillac with a black roof, entering the bookmaking business. Only about 2 weeks after the Air France robbery, Paulie approached the 3 men with a business opportunity. He offered them the chance to buy a 50% interest in Milty Wecker's bookmaking operation. Milty was in financial trouble after losing heavily on a bet and needed money. His operation, however, was valuable because he had wealthy customers and connections throughout the gambling world. His clients included garment industry executives, Wall Street brokers, doctors, lawyers, and professional bookmakers. Paulie offered to invest $50,000 if Henry, Jimmy, and Tommy put up the same amount. They agreed immediately at Aqueduct Racetrack. There were no lawyers or contracts. They simply shook hands, and Henry, only 24 years old, became involved in the bookmaking business. Working for Milty became an education for Henry. He earned $500 a week plus expenses and sat beside clerks who recorded the bets. Using a yellow legal pad, he tracked huge amounts of betting activity across baseball, football, basketball, horse racing, and other sports. Milty constantly monitored the bets and adjusted the odds depending on how much action he wanted. If too much money was coming in on one side, he could change the odds or send some of the bets to bookmakers in other cities. Tuesday was especially important because it was a day when bookmakers settled their weekly accounts. Henry helped prepare the payout sheets, which included winners' payments, expenses, salaries, payments to corrupt police officers, and even money borrowed from loan sharks when business went badly. But when Milty or the others needed money, Paulie could usually provide $25,000 or $30,000 without interest because he was a partner in operation. The police were always watching. Milty's operation had several different rooms around New York where bets were accepted. The group also paid off police officials, yet they could never understand how the police continually discovered their new locations. Eventually, they discovered the reason. Milty employed an older man whose entire job was to find apartments for the operation. He would travel around Long Island and New York, rent apartments, sign leases, arrange utilities, and install telephones. The police had apparently identified him. They simply followed him from one apartment to another and built a list of the gambling locations. Whenever they spotted one of the group's cars outside, they knew where the operation was. After about 4 months, Henry was arrested during a raid in August 1967. The police claimed the operation was handling around $2 million in bets every week. But Henry viewed the arrest as almost routine. They had received advance warning from police officers they were paying off. After being booked, Henry and the others even took the cops out for dinner before appearing in court. The following day, they were already operating from another apartment. Eventually, Henry pleaded guilty and received only a $100 fine. To him, the entire system seemed almost theatrical. The police arrested bookmakers, but the bookmakers continued operating, paid their fines, and went back into business. Henry takes over the suite. Around this period, another opportunity appeared. There was a popular restaurant and supper club called the Suite on Queens Boulevard near Forest Hills. Its owner, Joey Rossano, was a gambler and horse player who needed money. Henry made a deal with him. Henry would take over the business, while Rossano's name remained on the official paperwork. Henry also agreed to take over some of Rossano's loan shark debts. But Henry quickly realized that some of the people Rossano owed money to were not powerful enough to force him to pay. Because Henry was backed by Paulie and his crew, he simply refused to pay them and used intimidation to make them absorb the loss. For Henry's wife Karen, however, the suite seemed like something different. She wanted Henry to invest his money in a legitimate business rather than gambling and criminal activities. Henry agreed with Paulie before taking over the restaurant. Paulie liked the idea but gave one important order. The crew was not supposed to use the suite as their regular criminal headquarters. Paulie wanted Henry to keep the restaurant clean and legitimate. Henry threw himself into the business. He was there almost every day, from morning until night. Karen sometimes brought the children and helped with the accounting. Henry also hired a cook and investigated his employees. He discovered through Casey Rosato, a union official, that his bartenders were stealing enormous amounts of money from a restaurant. The bartenders were allegedly stealing around $1,000 every night, on top of their tips and wages. Henry fired all of them. The suite becomes a mafia hangout. For the first few months, the restaurant did well. Then Henry's friends began showing up. Jimmy came first, bringing Mickey and even a plant with a good luck banner. Tommy DeSimone came for a drink. Angelo Sepe followed. Marty Krugman, a bookmaker with a wig shop nearby, started spending time at the bar. Soon Alex and Mikey Corcioni appeared, followed by Anthony and Tommy Staybill. Little Vic Orena, a Colombo family lieutenant, became a regular. Eventually, even Paulie and members of the Vario family were spending time there. Within 6 months, the suite had transformed into a gathering place for Henry and his criminal associates. It became the group's unofficial final stop after nights out. The men would spend money everywhere else, then arrive at Henry's restaurant after midnight and eat and drink without paying. Henry eventually looked at the books and realized that some of his closest friends were slowly drinking his business into the ground. The debts were often eventually paid, but not necessarily with cash. Sometimes Henry received stolen liquor, stolen shrimp, counterfeit credit cards, or stolen travelers' checks instead. The suite gradually became more than a restaurant. It turned into a marketplace where various criminal schemes were discussed and arranged. Henry began selling illegally obtained airline tickets. He also directed wealthy gamblers toward crooked gambling games operated by the Varios. Sometimes he would even accompany the victims into the gambling apartment and pretend to lose thousands of dollars himself. The next day, his supposed losses would mysteriously return to him, along with a percentage of the victims' losses. Credit card fraud. Owning a legitimate restaurant also gave Henry access to the normal business and credit system, creating even more opportunities for fraud. Criminals would bring newly stolen credit cards to the suite before the cards had been reported stolen. Henry would immediately use them to create hundreds of dollars in fake restaurant charges. The restaurant therefore became a meeting point between legitimate business and organized crime. Henry now had countless responsibilities. He had to manage the suite, maintain his investment in Milty's bookmaking operation, deal with criminals, handle money, and constantly look over his shoulder. At the same time, his family life was becoming increasingly difficult. Karen was at home with their children and wanted someone to help with the housework. Henry was reluctant to allow a stranger into their home because he kept money, stolen goods, and weapons around the house. Eventually, someone offered him a disturbing solution. The housekeeper, a Haitian man named Eddie Rigaud, who had previously bought stolen cars from Henry, claimed he could arrange for Henry to obtain a young woman to work as a servant. Eddie told him that his family had connections in the mountains where young girls were purchased from their families and transported to Canada. Henry paid $600 for the arrangement. When the girl arrived in Montreal, Henry went to meet her, but when she opened the hotel room door, Henry was shocked. She was extremely large and intimidating. So intimidating that he pretended not to know her on the flight back to New York. When he finally brought her home, the children were frightened. She stayed only a day or two before Henry arranged for Eddie to take her away. The mysterious phone calls. Around the same time, Karen began receiving obscene telephone calls. The family changed their phone number and even made it unlisted, but the calls continued. Henry became increasingly suspicious. He wondered whether someone in his own criminal circle might be responsible. Unable to identify the caller, Henry and Karen decided to set a trap. Karen would pretend to be interested in the caller and convince him to meet her. One night in January, Karen called Henry at the suite and told him that she had spoken to the man. She had told him that her husband was away and that he should come to the apartment within an hour. Henry rushed home. The lights were turned off, except for one. Henry crouched near the front windows with a revolver hidden in his jacket, waiting for the caller. Snow was falling outside. After more than an hour, Henry noticed a car slowly passing the house. Then it came around again. The driver was alone and appeared to be looking directly at the house. Henry became convinced that he had found the caller. He hid behind a parked car and waited. The vehicle came around once more and slowed down in front of the house. The driver rolled down his window and appeared to be looking at the house numbers. As soon as the car stopped, Henry rushed toward the open window with his gun. He screamed at the man, demanding to know what he wanted. When the man moved, Henry struck him in the face with the gun. The man escaped from the car, but Henry chased him down and continued beating him. People began screaming, and Henry knew the police would soon arrive. When he heard the sirens, he ran away and hid the gun underneath the bumper of a parked car. The police arrived and discovered the injured man. Then Henry learned the truth. He had attacked the wrong person. The man was not the obscene caller. He was simply looking for a friend's house. Worse, the man kept telling the police that Henry had used a gun. The police searched the snowy area and eventually found a revolver hidden beneath the car. Henry was arrested for assault and possession of a loaded firearm. He spent the night at the police station until his bondsman, Al Newman, got him released. The real reason behind the calls. Eventually, the telephone calls stopped. Henry finally figured out how the caller had continued obtaining their new number every time they changed it. He went outside and examined the house from different angles. Then he realized that the telephone number was actually visible from outside to the kitchen window. Someone with binoculars could simply read the number directly from the telephone hanging on the wall. They changed the number again, but this time they left it blank and did not display it. The calls never returned. Henry admitted that attacking the wrong man had been stupid, but it reflected the mentality he had adopted. Act first, think later. By this point, Henry's life had become a constant mixture of legitimate businesses, gambling, organized crime, stolen goods, violence, money, and fear. The more successful he became financially, the deeper he was pulled into the criminal world. Chapter 10. For Henry and the people around him, killing had become an ordinary part of life. It was no longer something shocking or unusual. It was simply another tool they used to control people and settle problems. Henry remembered how proud Tommy DeSimone had been when he took Jimmy's teenage son, Frankie Burke, along on his first killing. Frankie was only about 16 or 17 and had previously been a timid kid who was constantly getting into trouble at home. His father had even sent him to military school to make him tougher. But after Frankie completed his first hit, Tommy said the teenager had handled himself extremely well. Jimmy was incredibly proud of him, almost as though his son had won an award. In their world, murder was considered the ultimate form of discipline. Everyone understood the rules. If someone betrayed the group, disobeyed orders, or became a serious problem, they could be killed. The death of Johnny Mazzola's son. Henry remembered Johnny Mazzola, someone he had known since childhood. Johnny's own son repeatedly robbed local card games and bookmakers despite being warned again and again. The group warned Johnny to control his son. They even gave the young man advice on where he could commit robberies without interfering with their own interests. Johnny's reputation and relationships protected his son for a while, but eventually the warnings ran out. The young man apparently believed that nobody would actually kill him. He was wrong. He was eventually shot twice in the heart at close range. Because of respect for his father, the killers deliberately left his face untouched so his family could have an open casket funeral. Jimmy and Remo. One of the most disturbing stories involved Jimmy and his close friend Remo. They had been extremely close. They traveled together with their wives and appeared to trust each other completely. But Jimmy eventually discovered that Remo had informed the authorities about one of his major cigarette shipments. Jimmy became suspicious when Remo refused to invest his usual share in a huge $200,000 shipment. Normally, Remo would invest a significant percentage, but this time he put in only $5,000. When Jimmy asked why, Remo claimed he simply didn't need the money. Then the shipment was intercepted. Jimmy's entire operation was lost. Still suspicious, Jimmy contacted people he knew in the Queens District Attorney's office. They confirmed his fears. Remo had apparently provided information about the shipment in exchange for his own freedom. Within a week, Remo was dead. What made the story even more chilling was that Remo had no idea what was coming. He had recently given Jimmy and Mickey round-trip tickets to Florida as an anniversary present. One night, while everyone was playing cards at Robert's, Jimmy casually told Remo, "Let's take a ride." Tommy and another man joined them. Remo sat in the front of the car, while Jimmy and Tommy sat behind him. When they reached a quiet location, Tommy attacked Remo with a piano wire. Remo fought desperately, but he was eventually killed. They buried him in the backyard at Robert's beneath concrete, right beside the bocce court. Afterward, whenever Jimmy and Tommy played there, they would jokingly greet the buried man beneath them. "Hi, Remo. How you doing?" Killing became entertainment. Henry explained that the men did not necessarily need a serious reason to kill someone. They would sit around drinking and talk about their previous killings as if they were stories from ordinary life. They would laugh about them and remember how terrified or helpless their victims had been. Arguments could quickly turn into shootings. Someone could say the wrong thing, insult the wrong person, or become involved in the wrong dispute, and suddenly someone would be dead. Violence had become so common that Henry described it as almost meaningless to them. Billy Bats returns. One of the most important incidents began after Billy Bats was released from prison. Billy had spent 6 years behind bars, and when a respected criminal returned from prison, the group traditionally threw him a celebration. The party was held at Robert's and included food, alcohol, and women. Billy was a respected Mafia member connected to the Gambino organization. Everyone was drinking heavily, including Henry, Jimmy, and Tommy. At some point, Billy noticed Tommy. Billy had known Tommy before going to prison, but back then Tommy had been only a teenager. Billy jokingly asked him whether he was still shining shoes. To Billy, it was just a joke, but Tommy took it as a serious insult. Tommy was extremely sensitive about his reputation. One of his brothers had previously cooperated with authorities, and Tommy had spent years trying to prove that he was tougher and more loyal than everyone else. He was constantly trying to establish himself. Even his choice of alcohol reflected his personality. While everyone else drank ordinary liquor, Tommy insisted on drinking Crown Royal, a Canadian whiskey that was difficult to obtain at the time. He had it smuggled in simply because he wanted something different and exclusive. Henry watched Tommy carefully and could see that Billy's comment had enraged him, but Tommy couldn't immediately respond. Billy was a made man, meaning Tommy could not simply attack him without consequences. If Tommy had openly slapped or assaulted Billy, the Mafia hierarchy could have demanded Tommy's death. So Tommy remained quiet. The party continued. People drank, laughed, and carried on. But Henry noticed that Tommy had not forgotten the insult. Later, Tommy leaned toward Jimmy and Henry and quietly said, "I'm going to kill that fuck." Henry joked with him, but he realized Tommy was completely serious. The setup. A few weeks later, Billy was drinking at the suite. It was late at night, and Henry was hoping Billy would eventually leave without causing trouble. Then Tommy walked through the door. Almost immediately, Tommy sent his girlfriend home and gave Henry and Jimmy a look. Jimmy understood. He began treating Billy warmly, buying him drinks and keeping him occupied. Henry realized what was happening. They were preparing Billy for the killing. Tommy quietly told Henry to keep Billy there while he went to get something. Henry knew exactly what Tommy meant. Tommy was going to get a body bag. In reality, a plastic mattress cover, so that Billy's blood would not be left throughout the restaurant after the killing. Tommy returned about 20 minutes later carrying the plastic covering and a .38 caliber handgun. Henry watched him return and realized that the situation had moved far beyond an argument or an insult. Billy Bats had been marked for death. By now, Jimmy had Billy Bats sitting comfortably in a corner of the bar. The two men were drinking and talking, and Billy was completely relaxed. As the night grew later, almost everyone had left. Only Alex Corcioni remained in the restaurant with his girlfriend. The bartender had also gone home. Billy had no reason to be suspicious. He was surrounded by people he considered friends, fellow members of the same criminal world. Jimmy even had his arm casually around Billy's shoulders. Then Tommy approached. Billy didn't even bother looking up. Suddenly, Tommy pulled a .38 caliber pistol from his pocket. The moment Billy saw the gun, he realized something was terribly wrong. Before he could react, Jimmy tightened his arm around Billy's neck, holding him in place. Tommy screamed the same insult Billy had used against him weeks earlier. "Shine these fucking shoes." Then he smashed the gun into the side of Billy's head. Billy's eyes widened in shock. Tommy struck him again. Jimmy kept him restrained while blood began pouring from Billy's head. Alex sees what is happening. Alex Corcioni saw the attack and began walking toward them. Jimmy immediately turned toward him. He was furious and ready for another confrontation. Jimmy challenged Alex, essentially asking if he wanted to get involved. Henry realized the situation could become even worse. Jimmy and Tommy were so enraged that they might kill Alex as well if he interfered. Henry quickly stepped between them. He acted as though he was about to attack Alex, but instead grabbed him by the shoulders and quietly pushed him toward the door. "Get out of here. They've got a beef." Henry managed to get Alex and his girlfriend outside. Even though Alex belonged to their own crew, Henry knew that Tommy and Jimmy were out of control. If Alex had challenged them, he might have ended up dead too. Henry locked the front door. When he turned around, Billy was lying on the floor. His head was covered in blood. Tommy had already opened the plastic mattress cover. Jimmy ordered Henry to bring the car around back. The problem with killing Billy. There was a major problem. Billy Batts was a made man in their criminal organization. Killing a made man without authorization was an extremely serious offense. There were rules and a hierarchy, and Tommy had just violated one of the most important ones. Billy was connected to the Gambino organization. If the Gambino crew discovered that Tommy had killed him without permission, the consequences could be devastating. Henry, Jimmy, and Tommy could all be targeted. They could potentially even be ordered killed by their own boss, Polivario. To prevent a larger conflict, they had no choice. Billy's body had to disappear. If the body were found, everyone would know that Billy had been murdered, and a killing could trigger a violent conflict between crews. But if the body simply vanished, there would be no proof of what had happened. The body in the trunk. Jimmy knew someone upstate who owned a dog kennel on a remote property. He believed nobody would ever search there. They wrapped Billy's body and put him into the trunk. Then they drove to Tommy's house because they needed a shovel. When they arrived, Tommy's mother was awake. She insisted that they come inside for coffee. The men had no choice but to sit down and have breakfast while a murdered man's body was sitting in the trunk of their car outside. Eventually, they managed to leave. They got onto the Taconic Parkway and continued driving. About an hour into the trip, Henry was sitting in the back seat, half asleep, with the shovel beside him. Tommy was driving. Jimmy was asleep. Then Henry heard a strange sound. Thump. He heard it again. At first, nobody understood what it was. Then the realization hit all three of them at the same time. Billy Batts was still alive. He was trapped inside the trunk and was banging against it. They had been driving to bury him, believing he was dead, but he was still alive. The final moments. Tommy became furious. He slammed on the brakes and grabbed the shovel. Nobody said anything. They waited until there were no headlights approaching from behind. Then Jimmy moved to one side of the car, while Henry stood on the other. Tommy opened the trunk. As soon as it opened, Tommy attacked Billy with a shovel. Jimmy grabbed a tire iron and joined him. Within seconds, the struggle was over. They got back into the car and continued toward the place where they intended to bury him. When they arrived, they discovered another problem. The ground was frozen solid. They had to spend about an hour digging before they could make the grave deep enough. Eventually, they buried Billy and covered the body with lime before returning to New York. But the story was not over. 3 months later, about 3 months after the burial, Jimmy approached Henry at the suite. He told him that Henry and Tommy would have to dig Billy's body back up. The owner of the property had sold the kennel to a housing developer. Construction workers were eventually going to be working on the land. If they discovered the grave, the entire secret could be exposed. That night, Henry and Tommy drove up in Henry's brand-new yellow Pontiac Catalina convertible. They dug up the grave. What they found was horrifying. They had covered Billy's body with lime to help destroy it. But after 3 months, the body had only partially decomposed. The smell was overwhelming. Henry became physically sick. He was vomiting repeatedly while they worked. They placed the remains into the trunk and transported them to a junkyard in New Jersey that they used. By then, enough time had passed that they believed nobody would recognize the body as Billy Batts. The smell that wouldn't leave. The experience affected Henry deeply. For an entire week, he remained sick. The smell seemed to follow him everywhere. He smelled it in the restaurant. He smelled it around his children's candy. He smelled it on his clothes. He became convinced that everything around him had absorbed the odor of the decomposing body. He threw away the clothes he had been wearing, including his shoes. But the smell remained inside the trunk of his car. Henry eventually removed all the upholstery and threw it away. He scrubbed the entire vehicle. He even placed a bottle of Karen's perfume inside the car and closed it, hoping the strong fragrance would eliminate the odor. Nothing worked. The smell seemed permanently embedded in the car. I don't know how many people Tommy killed. I don't even think Jimmy knew. Tommy was out of control. He'd begun carrying 2 guns. One night, Tommy shot a kid named Spider in the foot just because the kid didn't want to dance. It looked accidental, and Vinny Acero, who's with the Banana crew, took Spider to a neighborhood doctor to get the kid fixed up. We let Spider sleep in Roberts for a couple of weeks. He was walking around with his leg in bandages. But crazy Tommy kept making the kid dance. Tommy said he was using the kid for target practice. One night we're playing cards in the cellar. Tommy, Jimmy, me, Anthony Stabill, Angelo Sepe. When the Spider walks in, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and we're all smashed out of our minds. All of a sudden, Tommy wants him to dance. "Do a dance," Tommy says. For some reason, Spider tells Tommy to go fuck himself. Now we started getting on Tommy. Jimmy is joking, and he says to Tommy, "You take that shit from this punk?" We're all egging Tommy on, joking with him. He's getting mad, but he's still playing cards. Then, before anyone has any idea what he's going to do, he puts 3 shots into Spider's chest. I didn't even know where he had the gun, except for a second we're all deaf. I can smell burn. Nobody says a word, but now I'm convinced Tommy is a total psychopath. Finally, Jimmy yelled at him, "All right, you dumb fuck. If you're going to be a big fucking wise guy, you dig the hole." That was it. Nothing else. Nobody said anything else. Jimmy just made Tommy dig the hole right there in the cellar. And all the while Tommy was grousing and pissed off that he had to dig the hole. He was like a kid who had been bad and had to clean the erasers after school. Every day was some kind of war. Every day was another sit down. Every time we went out bouncing, somebody got bombed and there was a war. Everybody was getting very hot all the time. One night, Paulie, who was usually calm, came into Robert's crazy mad. He wanted everybody. Call Jimmy. Call the cab stand. Get Brooksy from the junkyard. I thought it was a full-scale war. It turned out that he and Phyllis had gone to Don Pepe's Vesuvio restaurant on Lefferts Boulevard, just a few blocks south of Roberts. Don Pepe's was a great restaurant, but the owner was a real pain. There were no menus, and he wouldn't take reservations. Everybody waited online, even Paulie. It turned out that Paulie and Phyllis had waited online for half an hour, while a new maitre d' kept seating one doctor after another in front of Paulie. When Paulie complained, the guy finally gave him a table, but he was pissed at Paulie. When Paulie ordered some wine, the maitre d' came a pour and, maybe by accident, spilled it all over Phyllis. By now, Paulie's coming out of his skin. But when the maitre d' pulled out a dirty rag and started putting his hands all over Phyllis's dress, Paulie turned over the table, and he started to slap the guy around. Paulie only managed to get 1 or 2 swings at the guy before he ran into the kitchen. When Paulie told him to come out, a half-dozen waiters with heavy pans and knives blocked the kitchen door. I never saw Paulie so angry. He said if the waiters wanted to protect their friend, then they were all going to get their heads broken. Within an hour, we had 2 carloads of guys with baseball bats and pipes waiting outside Don Pepe's. By 11 o'clock, the waiters and kitchen help got off. The minute they saw us waiting for them, they started to run. A few jumped in cars. We were chasing waiters and breaking heads all over Brooklyn that night. Henry admitted that he had no idea how many people Tommy DeSimone had killed. In fact, he wasn't even sure Jimmy knew the full number. Tommy's behavior had become increasingly violent and unpredictable. He had started carrying 2 guns, and even the people around him were beginning to realize that he was becoming completely uncontrollable. Spider. One night, Tommy shot a young man named Spider in the foot simply because Spider refused to dance. The shooting was made to look accidental, and Vinny Acero, who was connected to the Banana organization, took Spider to a local doctor to have his injury treated. Spider then stayed at Roberts for several weeks while his leg healed. But Tommy didn't leave him alone. Even though Spider was injured and walking around with his leg wrapped in bandages, Tommy repeatedly ordered him to dance. Tommy claimed he was using Spider as target practice. One night, around 3 in the morning, Henry, Jimmy, Tommy, Anthony Stabill, and Angelo Sepe were playing cards in the cellar. Everyone was heavily drunk. Spider suddenly walked into the room. Tommy immediately told him, "Do a dance." For reasons Henry could barely understand, Spider finally lost his patience and told Tommy to go to hell. Instead of calming the situation down, the others began teasing Tommy. Jimmy joked with him, asking whether he was really going to accept being spoken to that way by Spider. Everyone was laughing and provoking Tommy. Tommy became increasingly angry, but he continued sitting at the card game. Then, without warning, he pulled out a gun. Before anyone could react, Tommy fired 3 shots directly into Spider's chest. The room suddenly went silent. Henry could barely process what had happened. For a moment, all he could hear was a ringing in his ears. He could smell the gunpowder in the room. At that point, Henry became convinced that Tommy wasn't simply a violent criminal. He believed Tommy was genuinely psychopathic and completely out of control. Jimmy finally broke the silence. He told Tommy that if he was going to act like such a tough guy, then he could dig the grave himself. That was the only punishment Tommy received. He had to dig a hole right there in the cellar. What struck Henry as strange was Tommy's reaction. Tommy complained the entire time, acting like a child who had been punished at school and forced to do an unpleasant chore. The killing itself seemed almost meaningless to him. Constant conflict. Henry described their lives as a continuous series of conflicts. Every day brought another argument, another meeting, another dispute between criminal crews. Whenever the men went out looking for trouble or collecting money, someone could get beaten or shot, and suddenly another conflict would begin. People were constantly angry and looking for reasons to retaliate. Then one night, even Paulie Vario, normally one of the calmer and more controlled men, arrived at Roberts in an absolute rage. He demanded that everyone be contacted. Henry immediately thought a major war had started. Paulie wanted Jimmy. He wanted people at the cab stand. He wanted Brooksy from the junkyard. Henry assumed something enormous had happened, but the actual reason for Paulie's anger was almost absurd. Don Pepe's restaurant. Earlier that evening, Paulie and his wife Phyllis had gone to Don Pepe's Vesuvio restaurant, only a few blocks from Roberts. The restaurant was well known for its food, but its owner had an unpleasant reputation. There were no reservations. There weren't even menus. Everyone had to stand in line and wait for a table. Even Paulie had to wait. Paulie and Phyllis had been standing in line for about half an hour when the restaurant's new maitre d' began seating doctors ahead of them. Paulie became increasingly annoyed. Eventually, he complained and was finally given a table. But the maitre d' was clearly irritated by Paulie's attitude. Then things became much worse. Paulie ordered wine. When the maitre d' came to serve it, he somehow spilled the wine all over Phyllis. Paulie was already furious. But instead of simply apologizing, the maitre d' took out a dirty rag and began wiping Phyllis's dress. According to Henry's account, the man was touching her while doing it. That was the final straw. Paulie completely lost control. He flipped over the table and began hitting the maitre d'. Paulie managed to land only a couple of blows before the man escaped into the kitchen. Paulie demanded that he come back out, but the restaurant workers immediately closed ranks. About 6 waiters appeared at the kitchen entrance carrying heavy cooking pans and knives, preventing Paulie from getting to the maitre d'. Paulie's retaliation. Henry said he had never seen Paulie so angry. Paulie warned the workers that if they were going to protect their colleague, they were going to suffer the consequences as well. Within an hour, the response was organized. 2 carloads of men arrived carrying baseball bats and metal pipes. They waited outside the restaurant. By around 11 o'clock, the restaurant's waiters and kitchen staff finished their shifts and began leaving. The moment they saw the waiting men outside, they realized what was happening. Some tried to run. Others jumped into cars. But the men from Paulie's crew chased them through the streets. What had started as a dispute over a restaurant table had turned into a night of widespread violence, with waiters being chased and beaten throughout Brooklyn. For Henry, this was simply another example of the world they were living in. A minor insult could become a major conflict, and an argument could quickly turn into a violent confrontation. Henry began to realize that the constant violence was no longer just dangerous. It was beginning to damage the criminal business itself. The men had become so accustomed to solving every problem with violence that they stopped thinking about whether violence was actually necessary. Their attitude had become simple. Beat them, threaten them, kill them. Nobody stopped to ask why. Nobody considered the consequences. And that mentality was beginning to create serious problems. The cigarette hijacking. Henry usually didn't participate directly in the hijackings. Tommy, Stanley, Joey Allegro, and several others enjoyed the physical side of the work, confronting drivers, displaying guns, and taking control of the trucks. Henry's role was usually more business-oriented. He handled the distribution of stolen goods, knew the buyers, and arranged deals to move the merchandise. But sometimes they were short-handed, and Henry would participate personally. On one occasion, they were preparing to steal a $200,000 shipment of cigarettes. The robbery appeared almost risk-free because it was a give-up job. One of the two truck drivers was secretly cooperating with them. They intercepted the truck near the Elk Street warehouse as the drivers were turning onto the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. Tommy and Stanley jumped onto the truck's running boards, one on each side, and pulled their guns. The backup car followed behind with Henry and Joey Allegro. Stanley forced the cooperating driver to reveal the truck's dashboard security code. The truck had a special security system. Valuable shipments were protected by a dashboard keypad with several buttons. Without the correct code, the engine and doors could not be operated normally without triggering the alarm. Once they had control of the truck, Tommy put the drivers into the backup car. Henry and Stanley took the truck. They drove toward the place where they planned to unload the cigarettes. The warehouse. The destination was a legitimate trucking warehouse near the General Post Office on West 36th Street. Jimmy was already waiting there with 5 men who would unload the shipment. They had long rollers that allowed them to move the cigarette cartons quickly from the trailer into other trucks. The operation was designed to look completely ordinary. Other trucks were being unloaded at the same time, and the legitimate workers had no idea that the men were actually unloading a stolen shipment. For a while, everything went exactly as planned. Then a problem appeared. A large, aggressive man approached Jimmy and demanded to see the workers' union cards. Of course, they didn't have any. They had guns instead. The man was apparently responsible for enforcing union rules and immediately objected to Jimmy's workers unloading the truck. He threatened to shut the entire operation down. Jimmy tried to reason with him. The man refused. Jimmy offered him money. The man still refused. He insisted that the workers had to be union members. The problem was becoming serious because Jimmy had another $200,000 shipment of cigarettes scheduled to be unloaded at the same warehouse the following day. If the man continued making trouble, the entire arrangement could collapse, getting rid of the truck. Eventually, they had almost completely unloaded the truck. Only about 20 cases of Laredo roll-your-own cigarettes remained because nobody wanted them. Jimmy signaled Henry and Stanley that they needed to get the truck out of there. Thankfully, Stanley remembered the code required to start the truck without triggering the alarm. They quickly drove away. Their plan was to take the truck toward New Jersey and abandon it, but they had barely traveled a few blocks when Henry noticed something strange. People on the street were shouting and pointing toward the truck. At first, the men didn't understand. Then Henry looked out and realized what had happened. The rear doors of the trailer had been left unlocked. The unwanted cartons of Laredo cigarettes were falling out of the moving truck and scattering across 9th Avenue. People were shouting and pointing at them. The men pretended not to notice. Then they reached the next intersection. A police radio car was sitting directly in front of them. Henry immediately knew they had a serious problem. He told Stanley to pull over so they could close the rear doors. But Stanley couldn't. He had remembered the code needed to start the truck, but he couldn't remember the code required to open the doors from inside. If they tried to get out normally, the security system would trigger the alarm. They were trapped inside their own stolen truck. Escaping the truck. Henry and Stanley looked at each other. They had very few options. Finally, they decided to climb out through the truck's windows. The sight must have been ridiculous. 2 men climbing out of a large truck through its windows while trying to avoid a police car. As soon as they reached the street, they ran. They made sure nobody was following them and eventually returned to the warehouse. But Jimmy was still furious. The union enforcer had continued causing problems and was still threatening to prevent future trucks from being unloaded unless Jimmy used union workers. Jimmy couldn't tolerate the situation. A simple threat turns into murder. That night, Jimmy sent Stanley Diamond and Tommy DeSimone to to New Jersey. The original plan was not to kill the man. They were supposed to intimidate him and rough him up, essentially warning him to stop interfering with their business. But Tommy and Stanley became increasingly angry during the confrontation. They were furious that the man had ignored Jimmy. They were also irritated that they had been forced to travel all the way into the New Jersey countryside just to deal with him. Their anger escalated. What was supposed to be a warning became something much worse. They killed him. Once again, Henry saw the same pattern. A relatively minor business problem had become a murder simply because the men could not control their anger. The violence that had once been their solution to every problem was now becoming a liability. And the most frightening part was that, in their world, killing someone could happen almost accidentally. One moment they were trying to scare a man, and the next moment he was dead. Chapter 11. By 1969, Henry was only 26 years old, but he was already living a life of extraordinary wealth. He rented a house in Island Park, only 2 blocks from Paulie Vario's home. Henry and Karen each drove brand-new Buick Rivieras, and their house was overflowed with expensive possessions. Henry owned 15 Brioni suits, each costing around $1,000. He had more than 30 custom-made silk shirts and dozens of pairs of alligator and lizard skin shoes, carefully dyed to match his suits and cashmere jackets. There were so many clothes that Henry and Karen sometimes argued over who got to use the hangers. Their drawers were filled with expensive jewelry, platinum and gold watches, sapphire rings, antique brooches, gold cufflinks, and tangled chains made of silver and gold. Karen also lived extravagantly. She had a maid and owned 4 fur coats. Henry joked that she could go to the supermarket wearing mink. Even when she wanted cash, she had developed her own discreet way of communicating how much she needed. She would separate her thumb and index finger by a certain amount to indicate whether she needed a small, medium, or larger amount of money. Their children were surrounded by luxury as well. The baby's room was filled with expensive toys from FAO Schwartz, while the basement was packed with gifts. Enormous baby carriages, cashmere blankets, embroidered pillows, imported children's clothes, sterling silver spoons, and huge stuffed animals. Henry had reached a point where he seemingly had everything. Money, cars, jewelry, designer clothes, luxury, and eventually he had another symbol of success in his world: a girlfriend. The Mafia's idea of a girlfriend. Among Henry's associates, having a regular girlfriend was considered normal. Most of the married men had one. The expectation was not that a man would leave his wife or abandon his children. Instead, a girlfriend was treated almost like another luxury possession. Men would rent apartments for them, provide cars, buy them expensive clothing, and give them stolen jewelry. Having a girlfriend was seen as a sign that a man had made it. In Henry's world, it was almost comparable to owning a racehorse or an expensive yacht, except, as Henry described it, a girlfriend was considered the ultimate luxury. Meeting Linda. Henry met Linda by accident toward the end of 1969. At the time, he was preparing to spend 60 days at Rikers Island because of an offense involving untaxed cigarettes. One evening, Henry was having dinner at Michael's Steak Pub in Rockville Center with Peter Vario, Paulie's son. 2 women were also having dinner there, Linda and her friend Verilyn. Peter began talking to Verilyn, so Henry naturally began talking to Linda. The 2 women worked in Queens and shared an apartment on Fulton Street in Hempstead. After dinner, the group went to a small supper club called Val Anthony's, where they continued drinking and dancing. Linda was only 20 years old. She had recently returned from California and was deeply tanned and blonde. Henry immediately found her attractive. The 2 of them connected almost instantly. The evening seemed to unfold perfectly. Eventually, Peter and Verilyn separated from the group, while Henry and Linda continued talking and dancing. When Henry drove Linda home, they noticed Peter's car nearby. They drove around for a while and eventually returned. Peter's car was still there. By then, Henry and Linda had become very close, and they decided to spend the night together at Holiday Inn. The next morning, when Henry drove Linda home, Peter's car was still sitting outside. Paulie becomes suspicious. A few days later, Paulie came to Henry asking about the 2 women. Paulie had noticed that his son Peter had become obsessed with Veralyn. According to Paulie, Peter had been talking about nothing except Veralyn for days. Paulie wanted to meet her, but Henry sensed that something else was bothering him. The following Saturday, Henry and Paulie drove toward the women's apartment. On the way, Paulie finally revealed what he believed. They're cops. Henry was shocked. Paulie insisted that both women were police officers. Then he went even further. He believed they were FBI agents. Henry couldn't believe what he was hearing, but Paulie continued repeating that they would see for themselves. Paulie's paranoia. At the time, Paulie was under enormous pressure from federal investigations and grand juries. He had recently served 30 days for contempt of court. Investigators were questioning him about his gambling operation, meetings with other criminals, and even ownership of his boat. Paulie had become convinced that law enforcement was watching him everywhere. His suspicion had reached a point where he had installed a closed-circuit television camera outside his Brooklyn apartment. He would sometimes sit on his bed for hours, even in his underwear, watching the camera feed and searching for FBI agents. Whenever he thought he spotted someone suspicious, he would point them out. Henry believed Paulie was becoming paranoid. As far as Henry was concerned, there was no reason to believe Linda and Veralyn were FBI agents. The visit, when they finally reached Linda and Veralyn's apartment, Paulie refused to go upstairs. He was convinced the apartment might be wired with listening devices. Instead, he wanted Veralyn to come downstairs. Henry came up with a harmless excuse and used the building's intercom, pretending they were simply stopping by to say hello. Linda answered. She said Veralyn was out shopping but would be back shortly. Eventually, Veralyn appeared. She greeted Henry warmly and kissed him hello. She even invited them upstairs. But Henry declined, saying they were in a hurry. Paulie remained suspicious. He stood there looking around, especially at the windows, convinced that FBI agents might be watching them. For Henry, the whole situation seemed almost absurd. He had met Linda by chance, fallen into a relationship with her, and now Paulie's paranoia had transformed an ordinary romance into a potential FBI conspiracy. And Henry was about to discover just how seriously Paulie was taking the possibility that the two young women were actually undercover police officers. Henry quickly realized that Linda was exactly the kind of woman he enjoyed being around. She was intelligent, charming, and easygoing. She wasn't angry that he hadn't called her after their first date, and she didn't complain when he and Paulie suddenly appeared at her apartment without warning. To Henry, she was refreshing because there were no expectations or demands. While Henry was talking with Linda, Paulie kept quietly whispering under his breath, "She's FBI, she's FBI." He was careful to say it quietly so Linda wouldn't hear. Henry eventually became so tired of Paulie's paranoia that he decided to ask a question directly. They were all standing around Paulie's Fleetwood Cadillac when Henry looked at Linda and asked her outright whether she or Veralyn were police officers. Paulie looked at Henry as though he had completely lost his mind. Linda, however, burst out laughing. She explained that she worked at Bridal Land on Queens Boulevard. That answer immediately weakened Paulie's suspicions because Henry knew the business. Bridal Land was owned by Paul Stewart, a minor criminal who was essentially a front man for Vinnie Alloy, the son of Sebastian Buster Alloy, a powerful figure in the Colombo organization. As they continued talking, even Paulie eventually realized that Linda genuinely had no idea who they were. More importantly, she didn't seem interested in finding out. She wasn't impressed by their criminal connections or intimidated by them. Paulie quickly became bored and wanted to leave. Before Henry left, he told Linda that he was a CPA. She actually believed him. For weeks, Linda thought Henry was an accountant and that Paulie was simply a strange, overweight, older man who happened to be his friend. Henry and Linda, after that meeting, Henry began seeing Linda almost every day. He enjoyed being around her because she was fun and didn't make his complicated life more difficult. Whenever Henry appeared, Linda was happy to see him. There were no demands and no arguments. Henry was living an increasingly chaotic life, but Linda simply went along with it. Meanwhile, Karen had become accustomed to Henry not coming home every night. Henry and Linda were soon spending 3 or 4 nights together every week. Their relationship began affecting Linda's job. She would sometimes arrive at work after 11 in the morning because she had been out with Henry the night before. Her boss, Paul Stewart, eventually became angry with her and confronted her about her lateness. Henry decided to intervene. He went to the store and intimidated Stewart, making it clear that he should leave Linda alone. Henry claimed he didn't intend to seriously hurt him. He simply wanted to frighten him. But Stewart made the mistake of hanging up on Henry when he called the store asking for Linda. Henry called again. Stewart hung up again. That changed everything. Henry became furious. He grabbed Jimmy, who was at the bar, and told him they were going to the store. This time, Henry wasn't interested in merely threatening Stewart. The confrontation. When Stewart saw Henry and Jimmy approaching, he tried to run. They caught him in the back of the store. They beat him and demanded to know why he had hung up on Henry. The situation escalated dramatically. Henry even began wrapping the telephone cord around Stewart's neck, while the man begged him to stop. Customers inside the store began screaming and demanding that they let him go. At that point, the incident became much more serious. Because Stewart was connected to Vinnie Alloy, the matter could not simply be ignored. A formal sit-down was arranged to settle the dispute. At the meeting were Henry, Jimmy, Paulie, Vinnie Alloy, and Vinnie's father, Buster Alloy. Buster intervenes. Buster immediately treated Henry warmly. He had a reason to have a soft spot for Henry and Jimmy. They had previously given him a $60,000 share from the Air France robbery. But Buster understood that Henry had gone too far. He immediately began asking Henry not to kill Stewart. Buster explained that Stewart was important to his son. Vinnie Alloy owned an interest in the business through Stewart, and the restaurant/store provided him with income, and even served as the place where some of his cars were registered. Henry could see that Vinnie was furious with him, but Henry also knew he had the upper hand. He pretended to seriously consider whether Stewart should live or die, even though Henry privately knew that he had already gotten his anger out and wasn't actually planning to kill him. Still, he played along with the meeting. Eventually, out of respect for Buster, Henry agreed that he would let Stewart live. Then Stewart was brought out from the kitchen, where he had been waiting during the meeting. He was terrified. In front of everyone, he immediately apologized to Henry. He was shaking, begging, and even crying. He insisted that he hadn't known who Henry was connected to and promised to do anything necessary to make up for the disrespect. The dispute was finally settled. 2 separate lives. After the incident, Linda essentially stopped working. Henry and Linda began spending even more time together. Henry eventually rented her an apartment just around the corner from the suite. He now had 2 separate lives. During the week, he spent much of his time with Linda and his criminal associates, but he still maintained his family life with Karen. He would go home several nights a week, and on Saturday nights, he would usually take Karen out to a show or nightclub. Karen looked forward to those Saturday nights. During the rest of the week, she was occupied with the children, while Henry was out with his crew. Linda gradually became involved in Henry's social world as well. He took her along when he went out with the crew, and eventually everyone knew her. She was no longer simply a woman Henry had met by chance. Linda had become a permanent part of Henry's life. While Henry continued trying to maintain his marriage, his criminal business, and his relationship with Linda simultaneously. For Linda, meeting Henry happened almost by accident. She had originally met him because her roommate, Verilyn, had started seeing Peter Vario. When Henry and Linda met, they immediately connected. They both enjoyed laughing, going out, and having fun together. Linda remembered Henry as a kind and gentle man, very different from the image she might have expected from the people surrounding him. She noticed that Henry often helped people without looking for recognition. Sometimes he would do something generous for someone and make sure they never even knew he was responsible. To Linda, Henry seemed to have a softer side that his criminal associates rarely saw. Linda as Henry's escape. Linda believed that she became an escape for Henry. His life was full of pressure, especially because of his difficult relationship with Karen. According to Linda, Henry and Karen fought constantly. She described their relationship as so tense that they could barely have a normal conversation without it turning into an argument. Whenever Henry and Karen had a major fight, Henry would often leave and come directly to Linda. One time, Karen became so angry that she threw away all of their car keys. Henry had no car available, so he got on a bicycle and rode several miles to Linda's apartment just to see her. Linda viewed Karen as a very strong and demanding woman who put enormous pressure on Henry. She also remembered that when Henry and Karen first married, Karen had required him to convert to her religion and undergo circumcision while he was still very young. Linda remembered the recovery as particularly difficult, saying Henry had to walk around wearing a diaper for about a month. Henry was different around his friends. Linda also noticed something else about Henry. Although he spent his time around men involved in violence, gambling, theft, and other criminal activities, she believed Henry himself had a calming influence on them. She felt that he could make the men around him behave more normally. One example happened when Linda and Henry moved into an apartment near the suite. The furniture store couldn't deliver her furniture immediately. Instead of waiting, Henry simply gathered Jimmy, Tommy, and a truck. On a Saturday, the men drove to the furniture store in Hempstead and picked up Linda's furniture themselves. To Linda, the scene was almost funny. These men, who were feared throughout their criminal world, could sometimes behave like ordinary friends helping someone move furniture. Big, noisy kids. Linda said that Henry's friends often reminded her of big, noisy children. They were constantly laughing, joking, and looking for something entertaining to do. Jimmy was probably the biggest example. Linda knew him as Berkey rather than Jimmy the Gent. She had never heard anyone call him by his famous nickname. To her, Jimmy was simply a mischievous man who loved practical jokes. One of his favorite jokes involved water. At Robert's lounge or the suite, he would sometimes arrange buckets of water near the entrance. When someone walked through the door, Jimmy would dump the water over their head. Linda remembered Robert's as a strange but lively place. It sometimes felt less like a criminal hangout and more like a clubhouse for teenagers, except it had a terrazzo floor in part of the basement and a huge barbecue in the backyard. The walls were decorated with cherubs and sconces. Tommy even had an apartment on the second floor. There was also a strong social atmosphere around the place. Paul loved cooking, and everyone would gather around the food, trying different dishes and arguing about whether he had used too much salt or not enough garlic. For Linda, these memories created a strange contrast. The same people who were capable of frightening violence could also spend hours laughing, cooking, playing jokes, and acting like ordinary friends. Linda becomes attached. Linda stayed with Henry for a long time. As the relationship continued, she began to feel that she wasn't simply his girlfriend anymore. She felt that she had become part of his world. She became close to Henry's friends and their families. She knew that Henry had children and understood why leaving his family would be difficult for him, but she was deeply attached to him. For Linda, being with Henry was worth the complications. She kept hoping that eventually things would change. Every week and every month, she wondered whether this would finally be the time Henry stayed with her instead of returning home to Karen. But that moment never came. The holidays were the hardest. The worst times were the holidays. Christmas and New Year's were particularly painful for Linda. While Henry was at home with Karen and his children, Linda was often alone, waiting for him. She would wait for him to finish whatever he was doing with his family, so they could spend whatever time remained together. And Henry was often late. Sometimes he wouldn't come at all. He would occasionally make secret phone calls to Linda, but those calls often made her even more frustrated because they reminded her that she was waiting for him while he was living his family life. There were also occasions when Henry would send her away during the holidays. He would buy her a plane ticket to Las Vegas or the Caribbean and tell her that he would meet her on Christmas Day or shortly after he had finished spending time with his children. Linda would sometimes travel with other women connected to the same circle, including Tommy's sister, who was also involved with a married man. But when Henry failed to show up, Linda became angry. Sometimes she would deliberately extend her trip for another week and run up Henry's hotel bills simply because she was upset with him, a strange kind of normal. Despite all the complications, Linda remained deeply involved with Henry and his friends. She spent a great deal of time with them and gradually became accustomed to their lifestyle. Eventually, something that had initially seemed strange began to feel almost ordinary. She was surrounded by Henry, his friends, their girlfriends, their wives, and their families. The The parties, restaurants, jokes, arguments, disappearances, and complicated relationships became part of everyday life. For Linda, the criminal world around Henry slowly stopped feeling extraordinary. It became, in a strange way, normal. Karen began to suspect that Henry was seeing another woman shortly before he was sent to Rikers Island over another cigarette case. She was pregnant with Ruth at the time, and although she couldn't explain exactly why, she felt that something was wrong. Looking back, she realized there had probably been plenty of warning signs, but she hadn't wanted to see them. Then one day, a friend told her that she and her husband had driven past the suite and seen Henry standing in the doorway with another woman. The friend had considered stopping, but her husband thought Henry and the woman were having a serious argument, so they kept driving. Karen immediately knew something was wrong. She knew she had never been the woman standing there arguing with Henry. The name Lynn. Other clues began appearing. Karen would sometimes call the suite and ask for Henry without identifying herself. More than once, whoever answered the phone would casually say, "I'll get him, Lynn." Karen didn't understand. Who was Lynn? Whenever she confronted Henry about it, he became furious. He accused her of being paranoid and said she was making things up. Sometimes he would simply walk out of the house and disappear for a day or two. What frustrated Karen most was that Henry never directly denied the possibility that another woman existed. Instead, he would become angry, pack a bag, and leave, moving back to Queens. Karen eventually used another problem as an excuse to move the family away from Island Park. After Nassau County authorities raided a pizzeria and arrested Raymond Montemurro, Karen noticed two men sitting in a car taking photographs of her and the children. She immediately became frightened. She told Henry that Nassau County had become too dangerous and that they should move. Henry agreed. Within weeks, they moved to a 3-bedroom apartment with a terrace in Rego Park, only a few miles from the suite. But Karen had another reason for being closer to Henry's business. She began visiting the suite every few days. She told Henry she wanted to keep an eye on the books. But in reality, she wanted to keep an eye on everything. There were always people coming and going, and among them was a young woman named Linda, who worked at a nearby bridal shop. Linda would sometimes come into the suite for lunch and stay for a while. Karen saw her, but didn't suspect anything. In fact, Linda seemed so unhappy that Karen couldn't imagine she was Henry's girlfriend. The Halloween party. Karen remembered meeting Linda again at a Halloween party. Karen was there with Henry, while Linda was pretending to be involved with another man. Linda appeared extremely upset and was crying. At one point, Linda followed Karen into the bathroom. Karen, still unaware of the real situation, tried to comfort her. She told Linda that if someone was making her this unhappy, she should simply leave him. Linda continued crying. Karen even gave her a tissue. The irony was that Karen was comforting the very woman who was secretly involved with her husband. Linda continued appearing at the suite. Sometimes, when Henry and Karen were preparing to go out, Linda would already be sitting at the bar, looking miserable and crying into her drink. Karen assumed Linda was simply an unhappy woman who drank too much. She had no idea that Linda was upset because Henry was leaving with Karen. The chef reveals the truth. Eventually, a small mistake exposed everything. Karen called the suite looking for Henry. Again, someone referred to her as Lynn. This time, Karen lost her temper. She rushed to the suite, taking her daughter Judy with her, while she was heavily pregnant with Ruth. She went directly into the kitchen and confronted the Chinese chef. The chef barely spoke English. Karen demanded to know who Lynn was. The chef repeatedly tried to explain. No Lynn. No Lynn. Linda is Lynn. That was the moment everything finally became clear. Lynn was Linda. Karen immediately obtained Linda's address from the restaurant. The staff regularly sent food to Linda's apartment, so they knew where she lived. Karen took Judy and went straight there. Linda answered the building's buzzer without knowing who was outside. But when Karen reached the apartment and announced that they needed to talk, Linda suddenly refused to open the door. Karen kept ringing. Linda wouldn't answer. Karen continued ringing the bell for 2 hours, while Linda stayed inside and refused to open the door without Linda's side. From Linda's perspective, the situation was terrifying. She described Karen as hysterical, screaming outside the apartment. Karen was convinced Henry was inside. She even claimed she could hear Henry leaving through the fire escape. But Linda didn't even have a fire escape. Linda believed Karen was desperate to keep Henry and was becoming increasingly obsessed with the situation. The Bahamas trip, despite Karen's growing suspicions, Henry and Linda continued their relationship. At one point, Henry took Linda to Nassau in the Bahamas. The trip had another purpose. Henry wanted to help Paulie leave the United States for a long weekend before Paulie was expected to serve time in prison. Henry arranged false documents for Paulie and his wife. The group traveled together and had a surprisingly enjoyable trip. But Paulie was uncomfortable outside his familiar criminal environment. He was so nervous that he barely left Henry and Linda alone. Linda believed Paulie had enormous amounts of money, but very little experience actually enjoying it. She felt that Paulie almost lived through Henry. They went to the casino on Paradise Island, where Paulie and Henry had a line of credit. They also encountered Billy Daniels at La Concha and became his guests. At one point, they spent the night helping him look for a prostitute. When they eventually returned, customs officers selected Linda's luggage for an extensive inspection. Henry and Paulie found the situation hilarious and were reportedly on the floor laughing. Linda believed Karen eventually heard about the trip. In Linda's mind, the trip was proof that Henry was increasingly choosing her over Karen, not only taking Linda away, but taking her along with Paulie. Karen, she believed, was beginning to realize she was losing control. Henry comes home. Later that night, Henry returned home late. Everything initially seemed normal. The baby was asleep. Karen was moving around the house. Henry was tired and had been drinking, so he went to bed. He was almost asleep when he suddenly felt pressure on his arms and shoulders. When he opened his eyes, he saw Karen sitting on top of him. She was holding a .38 revolver directly at his head. Henry immediately recognized the danger. He knew there were bullets in the cylinder and knew the gun was loaded. Karen was shaking and breathing heavily. She pulled back the hammer. Henry suddenly became completely sober. Karen began screaming about Linda, the mysterious Lynn, the restaurant, and the chef. Henry realized how far her anger had gone. Instead of fighting her immediately, he started talking to her. He tried to calm her down and keep her focused enough to prevent her from pulling the trigger. Eventually, he managed to move her hand and take the gun away. Once the immediate danger had passed, Henry became furious. He hit Karen and told her he couldn't live like this. His reasoning was that he already had to worry about being attacked or killed by people in his criminal world. He didn't want to come home and worry about being shot by his own wife. He packed a bag and left. For the next couple of weeks, he stayed with Linda. It would become the first of many separations between Henry and Karen over the following years. Karen's side of the gun incident. Karen remembered the same night very differently. She said she was extremely angry when she picked up the gun. At first, she only intended to frighten Henry, but once she held the weapon, she experienced a strange feeling of power. The gun was heavy, and she had never held one like it before. She placed it between Henry's eyes and quietly called his name. When he opened his eyes, she deliberately cocked the gun because she wanted to understand just how desperate and hurt she had become. Yet, despite everything, she couldn't pull the trigger. Karen admitted that she still loved Henry and remained strongly attracted to him. Even after everything that had happened, she couldn't bring herself to leave him. Why Karen stayed? Karen knew that outsiders might have looked at her marriage and wondered why she remained with Henry. From the outside, there were plenty of reasons to leave. Henry was unfaithful. He disappeared for days. He was involved in dangerous criminal activities. Their relationship was filled with arguments. But Karen saw another side of him. She believed Henry could be incredibly kind, thoughtful, and gentle. She also remained deeply attracted to him. Her sisters even joked that she was obsessed with him because whenever they separated, Karen couldn't stop talking about Henry. And every time they reunited, Henry promised that things would be different. He would tell her that it was over with Linda. He would promise that the marriage would last. Karen wanted to believe him. And in her view, perhaps Henry wanted to believe himself as well. The other side of Henry. Karen also believed she was receiving the better side of Henry compared with Linda. Henry was a generous provider. She never had to beg him for money. If she wanted something, she usually got it. He didn't keep strict track of the money he gave her. She also knew that Henry could become extremely jealous. Once, he even threatened to burn down another man's business because he believed the man was interested in Karen. Strangely, Karen enjoyed seeing that jealousy because it reassured her that Henry still wanted her. So when she discovered Linda, Karen didn't think about simply giving Henry up. Her attitude was essentially, why should I lose my husband because another woman wants him? She didn't want Linda to win. Karen's view of Linda. Karen eventually began asking other wives about Linda and hearing stories about Henry's behavior when he was with her. She heard that Henry was often drunk around Linda. She heard that he could be cruel toward her and would sometimes make her wait in a car for hours while he played cards with his friends. Karen began convincing herself that Linda was actually getting the worst version of Henry. She believed that she was getting the best version. That belief helped Karen justify staying in the marriage. Despite the betrayal, the arguments, the violence, and the other woman, Karen still believed there was something between herself and Henry that Linda could never completely replace. And that complicated attachment, part love, part jealousy, part dependence, and part pride, would continue to keep Henry and Karen tied together. This part of Chapter 11 focuses heavily on Henry's chaotic personal life, especially his relationship with his wife Karen and his girlfriend Linda. It shows that although Henry had money, luxury, influence, and power, his private life was becoming increasingly unstable. Henry's double life. Henry spent most of his time with Karen and their children, but whenever Karen started arguing with him, screaming, or putting too much pressure on him, he would leave the house and go to Linda's apartment. He might stay with Linda for several days and then return to Karen. This cycle happened again and again. Henry admits that this madness continued even while he was imprisoned at Rikers Island. During his imprisonment, Karen discovered that Linda was on Henry's visitor list. She became extremely angry and confronted Henry at the prison. Karen told him that if he wanted her to convince social workers and parole officers that he had a strong family life, he had to remove Linda's name from the visitor list. For Henry, this was important because Karen's support could help him get released earlier. So, Henry eventually told the prison authorities to remove Linda from the list. Karen's efforts to get Henry released. Karen was not simply sitting at home waiting for Henry to finish his sentence. She visited him frequently and worked closely with his lawyer to get him released as early as possible. She complained about the terrible conditions at Rikers Island and the way visitors were treated. The visits were short, uncomfortable, and conducted through dirty glass partitions. Despite all of this, Karen continued fighting for Henry. She discovered that prisoners could receive time off their sentences for good behavior. When she was told that the rules had changed and Henry would receive less time off, she refused to accept the decision. She contacted the lawyer and collected documents showing that Henry had been sentenced under the older rules. Then she wrote letters to officials and the Board of Corrections and pressured everyone involved. Eventually, she succeeded in getting Henry a larger reduction in his sentence. Karen then became determined to get him home before Christmas. She looked for every possible legal way to reduce his remaining time, including getting credit for the days surrounding his arrest. Eventually, she managed to get his release moved forward. But then she discovered something that devastated her. While she had been fighting desperately to bring her husband home for Christmas, she discovered that Linda was also visiting him. She saw Linda's name on Henry's visitor list. Karen was furious. She felt that she was doing everything possible for Henry, while he continued maintaining his relationship with another woman. Henry returns to the street. When Henry finally returned from prison, Linda was furious with him because Karen had forced him to remove her from the visitor list. The first day Henry was back, Linda confronted him at the suite. They had a violent argument in front of everyone. Linda was wearing a valuable 7-carat black opal ring that Henry had bought for her. In anger, she removed the ring and threw it so hard that the stone cracked. Then she slapped Henry in front of everyone. Henry reacted violently and grabbed her by the throat before pushing her outside, but the argument continued on the street. Linda was wearing a white mink stole that Henry had given her. In anger, she took it off and threw it into a sewer. Henry then hit her. Afterward, however, he felt guilty. He realized that she was hurt and upset, so he ordered one of the workers to retrieve the mink from the sewer. He then took Linda home, and the two eventually reconciled. Polly and Jimmy intervened. After Henry spent several more nights with Linda, Karen contacted Polly and Jimmy. They came to Henry and essentially told him that it was time for him to return home to his wife. This shows how deeply Henry's criminal organization had become involved in his personal life. His marriage was not completely private anymore. Polly and the other men around him could intervene and tell him what he should do. Henry eventually admits that his life had become a constant battle. He couldn't leave Karen, but he couldn't leave Linda either. He felt that he needed both women. The main meaning of this section. This section reveals an important contradiction in Henry's life. He had almost everything that money could buy. Expensive cars, designer clothes, jewelry, restaurants, apartments, women influence, sell large amounts of cash. But he didn't have peace or stability. His life was becoming increasingly divided. Karen and the children. Up, down, arrow. Linda and his second life. And Henry kept moving between the two. Karen was deeply attached to him despite his infidelity. She was angry and jealous, but she also recognized that Henry provided extremely well for her and their children. She still loved him and did not want another woman to take him away. Linda, on the other hand, saw herself as Henry's escape from the pressure of his marriage and criminal life. She enjoyed being with him and became increasingly involved in his world and his friends. Henry therefore became trapped between two relationships. The deeper point. The chapter demonstrates that Henry's criminal lifestyle did not actually give him freedom. It gave him money and power, but it also brought constant paranoia, violence, prison infidelity, jealousy, unstable relationships, dependence on other criminals' fear of betrayal, constant conflict. In other words, Henry could control other people through money and violence, but he could not control his own life. That is one of the most important ideas in this part of the story.